It is the morning of December 13, 2006. We're here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick. We're here today to talk with Jerry Fitzgerald English, who served as Legislative Counsel and Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection in the Byrne administration, also served in other roles for Governor Byrne, including as a Commissioner of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. We're going to discuss Mrs. English's role in the administration and her various activities during the Byrne terms and after. Jerry, as we sit here today, many, many years after Brendan Byrne has left office as Governor of New Jersey, I'd like to start with your just general recollections about the Byrne administration and Brendan Byrne in your sort of lifetime in comparison with other governors and other administrations that you've looked at and been a part of.
Well, I did have the benefit of having been a small part of the legislature before the Byrne administration, because I'd been elected to the shortest term interim seat as a senator from Union County. And then I became counsel to the minority in the Cahill administration and served with the minority leader, J. Edward Craybill. So the long and short of that was that I had some opportunity to observe the legislature in action with the opportunity of the minority to point out all of the things that were wrong with the majority. There was a very limited access with Governor Cahill to the legislature, and it came only with the leadership, so that David Goldberg, who was the chief counsel to the minority, and Senator Craybill would go and call upon the governor. Tom Kean was subsequently governor was part of that group on the assembly side. Anyway, the long and short of it was that the resource issue of the government, its need for a balanced budget, those issues had already been teed up. They'd been teed up by Cahill, they'd been teed up by Governor Hughes. The Blue Ribbon Commission had already put in its report. And of course, what came out of that was the call for an income tax. Subsequently to that period of time, I ran for Congress, and then along came this gubernatorial election. So I was working for then Senator Craybill, who subsequently determined that he could not win a primary, and this person called Brendan Byrne appeared as being the party's nominee. And I participated with Dave Goldberg and Joel Stearns in drafting the party platform. That's when I started to find out that party platforms were really wonderful documents that no one ever looked at ever again. But we had at that point come into the post-Watergate era. And so that was the opportunity, I think, for the Brendan Byrne administration and legacy to have a time to shine. And we were emboldened. We tried all sorts of things that in another time would not have passed. He had both houses of the legislature, as you recall, which was sometimes a burden as opposed to a blessing. For the most part, we had pretty responsible bipartisan support on bills that were important. And so my job, when he invited me to join his staff, was legislative counsel. And at that point, I think that was unique. There hadn't been something called a legislative counsel. The general, the chief counsel and his staff basically did that work. Or the governor himself, depending upon what role he determined to undertake, and those who had been in the legislature before, former governors that had been in the legislature before, often did that job themselves.
let's backtrack a bit. When did you first meet Brendan Byrne?
I met him many years beforehand when he was the prosecutor, fleetingly in the Essex County Courthouse. He didn't remember that, but I did. More because there was this very, very young person who was the prosecutor, and I found that quite astounding that someone who appeared to be so young could have such an important job. Then I didn't see him for years, and of course at that point he'd gone on to be the BPU commissioner, he'd gone on to be a judge, and I never appeared before him, and frankly did not meet him again until the election, the primary time.
Can you recall any of the circumstances of that first meeting in the campaign season?
Well, I recall saying I wouldn't meet with him because Dick Leone and Dick Coffey had also been a candidate, and Jimmy Dugan was very anxious for me to come over and meet this fellow because Coffey had stopped his campaign. Wanted me to come over and meet this fellow called Brendan Byrne, and I said thank you very much, but I don't think that's appropriate because I am working for Senator Craybill. On the day that Senator Craybill determined not to run, and within a short period of time, I did meet Brendan Byrne and with Kenny McPherson, and was placed in the back of a car with the two of them to go to a rally in Bayonne, whereupon I started to find out something about this person. But at that point, I'd already been invited to head up what was called Citizens for Byrne, and that was all of the diverse groups that were going to be involved in the campaign. So my first recollection of this person was someone who was basically terrified, going along with Mayor Fitzpatrick to go to this rally, which was held in Bayonne, involved motorcycle escorts, and a lot of people with white handkerchiefs waving them, and woman walking up to Mayor Fitzpatrick and saying, "Who's this?" The mayor said, "This is Brendan Byrne." And she said, "Are we for him?" And he said, "Yes, we are." She said, "Okay." Whereupon I began to understand something about party discipline and the importance of having the line in various counties.
Talk a bit more about the politics of that 1973 campaign, particularly before Brendan Byrne gets into the primary race. You mentioned some of the candidates, but what was your take on that sort of early primary field?
The early primary part also involved Ralph DeRose, and he was the favored person of the then Essex County chairman, who was considered all-powerful. And I began to learn something about the rivalries between Hudson County and Essex County, and which one was capable of really bringing out that vote. Ralph DeRose was a senator in during the time that I was serving as legislative counsel, so of course I knew him. And the Republican aspect of this was starting to become quite fractious. They basically renounced the incumbent governor, Cahill, and Charlie Sandman, who had been a congressman and who voted for everything that Richard Nixon ever wanted, made him just kind of this perfect foil in terms of how the campaign was starting to come along. But at that point, at the early parts, it was really more about state issues, about what were we going to do to ensure that we had some sort of sustainable revenue. And the environment was starting to percolate as a really, really important political issue. the bills that were passing in the legislature were, well, one of the reasons that I started to volunteer to read the bills was that I found that sometimes there wasn't a lot of attention to that. And so it was my early job to examine all of the bills and make recommendations to our leadership about positions that they might want to take. And aside from the fact that there were personal allegiances, I was really not, at that point, attuned enough to understand the statewide implications of how these primary things were working out and who had what and who didn't have what, except for Edward Craybill, who was the sort of person that would tell you within 100 votes of how he thought a campaign was going to turn out. I mean, today's professional staffs do that. We didn't need a professional staff. J. Edward Craybill could count. He also, which was one of the reasons that I think that he was subsequently put into the position of Secretary of State, because at that point the Secretary of State was the political arm of the administration. Much changed today, but in those days that was one of the roles. The fact that there had been, unfortunately, some scandals within the Cahill administration involving that office were one of the things that, again, started to talk about the kind of people that one was looking for. We were looking for people of integrity. We were looking for people with credentials of credibility. And what was unknown to me at the time, and how this happened, I don't know, but I never really realized for some time that Brendan Byrne had been kind of an old hand. I mean, he had been Governor Minor's executive secretary. He had been there, done that in an earlier administration. So he knew far more about this than I think he elected to let people know, until it was probably more in the time when he was governing. And that was also very interesting.
Now, you mentioned that you knew Ralph DeRose from your time in the Senate. What was he like personally and politically?
Well, personally, he was a very charming man, always very gentlemanly, bright, articulate on the floor. And one of the things that Senator Craybill did as the leader, which is one of the things that I always admired, was that he knew before we went into any session exactly where his vote was and which ones were not going to be there in the count, whether or not he could put forth a party position and have it hold, and whether or not he could say to the Governor Cahill, this will be the position of the Democrats, this is how many votes I will be able to deliver on this bill. I cannot tell you about this bill and that bill. I think when Senator DeRose became an active candidate and Eddie Craybill was someone who was going to run against him, that there may have been some tensions there. But they did not manifest themselves in the caucus or on the floor. Again, it was a time of gentlemanly behavior, of respect for another person's situation. And as they say, it was, at least for the people that were around the circumstances, there was nothing unpleasant. What went on behind other doors, we were sheltered from.
Another candidate in that race was Ann Klein. As one of the relatively few politically active women of that time, did you find your position a little bit difficult, supporting these white males, first Ed Craybill and later Brendan Byrne, against one of the prominent women Democrats in that race?
Not at all. I had and I continue to have such respect for Anne Klein. And of course she had come out of the nominally nonpartisan world of the League of Women Voters. And having been a member of the League, it frustrated me no end that what they did was study everything to death, but they really weren't out there in the hustings getting it done. But occasionally they would take a position such as being against the sales tax at the time when Governor Hughes was trying to pass it, and they defeated that tax. So that they were capable of educating in a way if they elected to. But Anne was a person of just such incredible integrity also. Brought a clarity to the issues, brought the need for sharpening the positions on all of the candidates, because she could be counted upon in debate to really be a very articulate and humane voice for issues that were probably not right there in front of everyone else. Most of the other candidates were talking about other kinds of things, but you could always depend upon Anne to come in and do the kind of discussion that was focusing on those without a voice, those who ultimately, when she became a cabinet officer, of course, she defended and had the most substantial part of the budget for. So she was an extraordinary person, worked very well in the cabinet, and was always the person, in case anybody started to stray away from why you were in government at all, to remind that was a very, very important part about why we were doing that, why we were there.
Did you have any contacts with her before that campaign?
As a member of the League, yes, but not close ones.
Now, when Brendan Byrne does announce that he's going to become a candidate relatively late in that primary season, what was the attitude within the Craybill camp? That all was over, or was there some thought that possibly we could stick this out?
Oh, there was, in fact, kind of almost jubilation, because the first thing that Eddie Craybill said was, "Oh, he's Miner's man, and Hudson hates Miner." Of course, this was kind of going a little over my head, like, oh, because you may remember that I am not a New Jersey native and had never, in fact, even lived in the state until 1963. So that past history was being, set forth to me because I knew absolutely nothing about it. Although I had run for of all things, I ran for the state senate when Governor Miner was trying to make a comeback. So I got to meet him on the campaign trail a little bit and found this rather frosty, difficult person that I later found out to be was not his persona at all if he decided to tell you his terrible pun jokes and stuff like that. But, it was kind of, oh, well, that's not going to be such a problem because, first of all, he doesn't have the time, he doesn't have the money, and he certainly doesn't know any of the issues, and Hudson will never go for him.
Now, in your own political education during that campaign, why was Craybill wrong in his assessment of the Hudson position?
Well, I think he underestimated what his old friend, the senator, the mayor, the Hudson County leader was going to do. And that's when
Mayor Fitzpatrick.
Yes, Mayor Fitzpatrick. That's when the arcana, if there's such a word, I like that anyway, we'll use it,
All right.
of Hudson County politics, which Senator Billy Musto used to explain to me patiently, because when I sat on the floor of the legislature, I sat between the Middlesex delegation, and right behind my shoulder sat Billy Musto. And they would have a very, very important discussion on the floor, and someone would be for a bill, and they would carry on and on about it. And then he'd reach over and tap me on the shoulder, and he says, he's not going to vote for it. I said, how did you know that, Billy? He got word. Those were still the days of pretty significant influence of the county chairman for those who elected to do it. So that's about how things were starting to go along, and I started to learn more about really the nuts and bolts of who was where, with whom were you meeting, the various interest groups that would be very important to determine whether or not you got their endorsement. Of course, I had been through that in my own congressional campaign, but this was on a far different level.
In other interviews, we've heard a lot about Mayor Fitzpatrick and the various negotiations and understandings during the first Byrne campaign and thereafter. What are your recollections of the mayor?
Well, first of all, this very genial person, because at the time I was seeing him, the deal was done. And it was clear that these people could deliver a vote. And that was absolutely key. Beyond that, I really didn't have any, the person who really knew all of this was Kenny McPherson, who was lifeblood every single day. That's what you could count on to find out from Kenny, who was had a long history with Brendan Byrne, and again was one of those people coming out of Hudson County that the best and the brightest.
Were your first contacts with Mayor Fitzpatrick after he endorsed Brendan Byrne? You had no contact with him when you were in the Senate?
That's right. No, and that was my first that I recall.
Who were the other sort of political powers that you recall or had some personal contact with?
Well, subsequently, of course, the Essex County chairman, my own county chairman, Chris Dietz, who was the first one to come out for Brendan Byrne, and he had known him from earlier days in the Hughes administration and in the Constitutional Convention, going way, way back.
And of course, Don Land, who worked under Chris Dietz at that time, also became a significant figure.
And Don Land was also from my county. And I think one of the things that also happened was that because the headquarters of the campaign was in Union County, right on Route 22, a lot of people from Union County that I already knew then became part of that campaign and were important as operatives, as volunteers. The role of volunteers in those campaigns were far more vigorous and robust than I understand them to be today. There were very few paid professionals. You really did have your, I won't say grassroots, but if somebody caught on and seemed to be someone that people were excited about, then they felt free to knock on the door and say, is there something I can do? And I say with regret, I don't think that that's quite the same in politics anymore. Maybe at the primary level, when people now will travel all over the country on presidential campaigns. And that's what I started to find out about in the course of the campaign. These various groups that I was supposed to harness and get them to energize their membership and what have you, was supposed to be the grassroots part of the campaign, which was exceptionally interesting, and was that below the organizational construct of the counties.
Now, you said that Senator Craybill didn't think that Brendan Byrne would be able to get the backing of the Hudson organization. In fact, Brendan Byrne does get the Hudson County line. What was the attitude within the Craybill camp when that happened?
Well, I had been up actually in West Orange on for the debate of, and I don't think Senator Craybill was there. I don't remember whether he was there. But anyway, I had my card table up, and I was passing out all this Craybill stuff, and the first thing I did was to meet Brendan Byrne's sister. And so here I am holding on to all of this, Craybill stuff, and she's patiently telling me what a good person her brother is. And I said, well, I'm sure that's the case. But I was very much up and front, and then I sat right in the front row and listened to the debate and reported back dutifully that unfortunately, as nice a person as he was, A, he was a dreadful speaker, B, he didn't know anything about the issues, and that Eddie would walk all over him. And of course I jest about this and say, because of Eddie's charisma, Eddie was the most uncharismatic person you could imagine in that sense, but he was such an earnest, he absorbed facts. His engineering background showed. He would tell people things, and you knew that he was telling you that's exactly what it is. Now, one little small side to this is it was the beginning of public disclosure of personal assets and your wealth. And when David Goldberg and I had to say to Eddie, gee, I don't know how to tell you this, Senator, but you're going to have to tell people what your financial holdings are. Of course, he considered us wild people, that anyone would suggest such a thing. It's not anything so personal. But this was, again, post-Watergate, new rules. So he reached down into his legendary briefcase where he carried every single piece of paper that he was going to need, and he handed me his business card. And he wrote on the back of it, and he handed it over to me, and I looked at it. He says, those are my holdings. I said, on the back of this business card? He says, yes, when I graduated from Rutgers, which was one of the high points of his life, his Rutgers affiliation. He said, I bought shares of AT&T, and this is what I have bought since, and I have never sold anything. So this was also watching the change in someone else. So anyway, after I report all of this to Dave Goldberg and to the senator, the next morning, they announced to me that they had folded camp without telling me. So they sent me up there well knowing that this is what they were going to do. And so I don't know about the rest of them, but I was pretty mad and said, oh, thanks for sending me up there. However, I must say that I have since been told by the governor himself that Eddie was very careful about understanding what happens when these things go on, and that he asked that the governor be sure that people in his campaign were given roles that were substantial in Brendan Byrne's campaign. Thinking back on it, that probably wasn't too hard because he had no infrastructure at all, and the others had existing ones. And of course, the Middlesex role, the Willents role, even though Dave Willents at that point was allegedly, no longer going to be the kingpin, he remained the kingpin. And one of the things that I do recall from that early time was Dave Willents coming out of retirement to a rally in Middlesex County for Eddie Craybill. Again, this was the sort of thing that showed how that organization was also a very disciplined one, along with Essex and along with Hudson.
Did you either then or subsequently get an explanation from either Ed Craybiel or Dave Goldberg as to how they sort of assessed the political pros and cons when they made the decision to pull out?
I think it was all the Hudson line. I mean, they clearly weren't going to get the Essex line because that was the DeRose line. And without that combination, Eddie would have been the first one to say the numbers won't make it.
Now, you mentioned Dave Valence. Talk a little bit more about this very important figure in New Jersey history.
Well, of course, I got to know of him just faintly in the beginning. And I was, of that time, a little wary of all people that called themselves party chairmen. As a group, they were not exactly the kinds of folks that I thought were the ones I wanted to be around too much. But nonetheless, there were people who were legends, and of course his legend went back to the Bruno Hauptmann trial, and how he developed his position in Middlesex County. So, but it was really more after the governor was in office that I got to know more about David Valence. As people who knew him will recall, a short, slight man, always chewing on an old cigar hanging out of the side of his mouth. And and the various interests that he represented, that's when it started to, that's when I was starting to know something more about him as opposed to this political figure. He was there on behalf of his clients or interests that he was representing. And one classic one to me that I have always remembered and that has guided me is that there would be a meeting with David Valence, and the governor would always be delighted to see him. He would come into the governor's office, he would talk about whatever it was that he was concerned about that day, and then he would go away and we would start to have a conversation in that middle big office, and then a knock would come on the door and David Valence would come back in and he'd say, "I just wanted to be sure that I got what I came for before I left." So that part of not leaving something unresolved with a yes or a no was part of his wonderful technique of, and I'm sure he did that all the time. So he was the one who had this wonderful, almost fey quality. And of course he would make sure that everybody was taken care of at the racetrack. Advised me personally never to invest in anything that eats, which I have paid very close attention to. And seemed to understand the melding of the public and the private life.
What was his style as a negotiator, as a lawyer for his clients? Forceful, laid back?
No, he was always very persuasive, very bright, and he was always very worried if you'd go and visit at his law office, which I did subsequently, and he would worry about whether or not they were going to make enough money to keep the doors open. And so, his concern about the law firm was palpable. And subsequently, when his son became candidate for the Chief Justice and that sort of thing is when one saw all sorts of sides of things. But he was also a very valuable resource because he was somebody that understood political beings and how to read them and how to approach them, to understand the high ego factor involved in people in public life and at high positions, and meanwhile never keep losing track of why he was there. Did I get what I came in here to talk to you about, or did I explain to you what it was I came in here to talk to you about? he did not waste any audiences.
Now, you said that Dave Wilentz was, at least to the outside world, sort of phasing out his political role at that point, which would have been in the 1973 campaign. But from your perspective, what was the relationship between Dave Wilentz and Senator Craybill? Was it clear that Dave Wilentz still was the power in Middlesex County, or was Ed Craybill thinking, well, now I'm number one?
I don't think there was any confusion that at the end of the day, the Wilentz factor was very, very important. It was one that was respected. And having Dave Wilentz introduce Eddie Craybill as he did, as this is an honest man, that had a lot of political importance. It was the sort of thing that showed the gravitas with which people did these kinds of jobs and how seriously they took them.
And more generally, in terms of the county chairs in the early 1970s, you've already said that they were still powerful figures, probably more powerful than they are today. But how did they exercise their power? How did a Dave Wilentz or a Dennis Carey or other county chairs implement their power and get their wishes accomplished?
Well, I think they were pretty much past the point where someone would just call up and say, on this bill, I expect you to leave the room, or, you know, you better be for this bill, even if you have to grit your teeth. Things were a little more subtle. However, when major votes, for instance, you know, when we had really major legislation coming up and we thought that the county chairman could be helpful, Governor Byrne didn't hesitate to reach out for them and get them together to the extent that he thought that they would be able to exercise any influence over the candidates. The role of the county chairman in those days was far more important in terms of money raising. I mean, that was where the money was that was at that level that the money was being raised. And so they had some pretty powerful opportunities. I mean, that each one would be out having to raise money for themselves. I'm sure that happened, but the juggernaut was coming from the county coffers and those kinds of events that were the regular giving method. And of course, this was before public financing or anything of that nature.
And of course, another sort of tool that they had was the power to select candidates and to control the county committees that, I believe, for the most part, generally sort of did their bidding at that time. Is that true?
Well, I guess if you were really part of that system, I refused to, on a personal basis, I refused to ever even meet our county chairman until I went down to screen for the Senate. I had run for the town council in Summit. I think the last, well, they never did elect a Democrat in Summit. They appointed one once in the Great War, because everyone else had gone to war. Then as soon as it was respectable, you know, they kind of, so I never met the person, and of course I did get to know him later on, but there was kind of, one kept one's distance from my personal point of view with that organizational figure. And maybe it was just because I had an instinct about it that, you know, this was not my game. That I was not, if somebody wanted me to be doing what they told them to do, then they'd pick the wrong person. And so I managed to get through the screening committee without ever even having met the man.
But that was relatively unusual at the time.
I would think so. And at that point they were kind of saying, oh, this will be novel. Why don't we have a woman? Gee, that'd be interesting. We won't let her run for the full term, of course. But it's okay to let her run then, and Betty Wilson was part of that particular group, so, you know, a couple of women showed up. And again, it was part of the thing that was starting to happen in politics.
Let's go back, I guess, to that 73 primary campaign. You made a couple comments that Brendan Byrne wasn't viewed as the most skilled candidate on the stump. Talk a little bit more about his style, his speaking ability, and so forth in that first campaign.
Well, no one will believe it today because, you know, he's the most sought after raconteur, after dinner speaker, head, you know, let's get it together, and if Brendan is going to speak, at least it's going to be, as bad as the whole thing may be, and you may have been dragged there, it's at least going to be entertaining because, you know, he'll talk. That sure was not the Brendan Byrne that was showing up on that campaign. He would, first of all, fumble around, look basically terrified most of the time, couldn't remember anyone's name, and would talk in this mumbly way about not too much, and people would hand him briefing papers and that sort of stuff. He disguised a sense of humor. And so that's, you know, became one of those surprises that when you start to know somebody, to find out that not only is there a sense of humor, but a very, very sharp wit. And you usually cannot be witty unless you really understand something. And so his intelligence, and he was masking an awful lot. Of course, he had just stepped down, and let's go back, he had just stepped down from being a state judge, where everyone is fawning on you all the time, and yes, sir, and whatever you say, judge, and if your honor, please. And when Fariborz Fatemi was on the road with us, he always called him judge. So now, judge, you really must come over here, and you really must do this. Well, this is a person that wanted to be home at 6:30 at night. Didn't like going into any of the union halls that you had to go into, or any of the kinds of things that people do in campaigns. So he had to kind of be persuaded to say that this was, you know, here is the schedule. I'm not going to do that. No, I don't want to do that. Well, but judge, you really must come and meet these people. It is very important that you come there. Well, so, you know, it wasn't just kind of you handed something, or he was handed by the campaign. Here's where you'll go, and this is what you'll do, and this is what you will say today. This was being resisted. And, of course, what some of us didn't know was that he had used to run around and be Miner's voice on the campaign trail. So he had done this for years. It wasn't as if he had never done this before. He was coming back into it after a pretty long period of time. But there was I just can't say his name for a moment, legendary figure, a congressman from Middlesex County. And the two of them would run around for Miner in the old days. And of course, Brendan was the straight man, and this other guy who was
Eddie Patton.
Oh yes, Eddie Patton. Thank you, Eddie Patton, who was just outrageous. And he was an equal opportunity insulter of all ethnic groups, and somehow he could make these terrible jokes and get by with it, which would never happen today. Bright. Also part of the Willands group, of these very, very bright people that were representing the Middlesex delegation, whether in Congress or in the state. And so, but he started to come along. he started to come along. I mean, he had also, made a very substantial personal decision to step out of a lifelong job with guaranteed pensions, and he had 7 children, and go back to a practice that he didn't have any clients left from. And so, maybe he was as terrified as he should have been under the circumstances.
Did you or Ed Krabiel or others that you talked to during the campaign, as you watched Brendan Byrne fumble and stumble through that primary campaign, start talking about maybe you were backing the wrong horse, or that he could possibly lose this election even with the support of Hudson and the other sort of qualities he had going for him in that primary campaign?
No, it never came to that point. I mean, I think they all hugely enjoyed the fact that they knew more about everything than he did. But the learning curve was obviously pretty quick. And the part about getting comfortable with the crowds of people and those kinds of skills that are automatic with some political people. You think about the best political people you've ever watched: Hubert Humphrey, Bill Clinton. It's an automatic thing. They just automatically think that you're the most important. Who could be more important than me? Because this person wants to talk to me. That kind of quality was not right there. I think it came on, but not in the same way. He is not. His brother, Frank, was the natural politician in that sense, of knowing everybody's name and making them feel immediately comfortable. And the prosecutor part of Brendan Byrne never left, and still doesn't to this day, in my view. He is still there as the truth seeker, and not just a glad-hander.
Now, a couple other people who joined the Byrne campaign from another campaign, specifically the Dick Coffey campaign, or Dick Leone and Luke Hayden. Talk about them.
I did not know them, except Luke Hayden and I both ran for Congress at the same time. And Luke Hayden took on the Willanth's machine, because then it was a good thing to call it a machine. And here's this frighteningly bright whippersnapper kid, also from Perth Amboy, daring to take on the establishment. So I knew about him, and I think we probably, met one another on that kind of campaign trail briefly, but I did not know Dick Leone at all. And of course, I knew Dick Coffey because he'd served in the Senate during the time that I was involved, and he was the county chairman. I had huge respect for him. That these fellows appeared out of that campaign and from the older times in government, I really didn't know about that. I just knew that, these two very, very bright people appeared, who were policy-oriented people, and they were kind of in charge.
Now, given the prominence that Luke Hayden took in the campaign, along with Dick Leone, and as you said, he challenged the Willanth's organization, of which Ed Krabiel was a significant player. Did that create some tension within the Middlesex County sort of people, and with Ed Krabiel specifically?
Well, I'm sure that it did. Again, these were, how dare they? These kids, what do they know? And there was some disdain operating in both directions. These were the old war horses. Let's get rid of them. They don't have any ideas. We have them all. There was enough arrogance to go all the way around and dismissiveness to go all the way around. So that getting people of different ages with different backgrounds into any campaign to work cohesively so that you could concentrate on what you were there to do was no small feat. And I think people like Dick Coffey, Jim Dugan were very helpful in that respect.
Of course, unlike most of the other candidates and most other candidates in other races, Brendan Byrne gets into this race without a real core of Byrne people. He's recruiting people from other campaigns, putting a campaign organization together almost from scratch. Was that difficult, sort of melding all these people who got started off with other candidates that they were loyal to and trying to get them all to work together from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, not really, because I was out trying to talk to people who had no role in the campaigns. Those kinds of internal machinations really were not part of what I was concentrating on. I was out meeting brand new people and saying, this is an opportunity for New Jersey to go in a different direction.
Well, describe more your sort of day-to-day role, particularly in the early campaign and with these citizens organizations, and who did you work with in the campaign and in trying to contact these groups and to talk to them, and just what was it like?
Well, I was invited to do this by Lou Caden. I mean, personally. He said, "Would you head up this Would you head up this part as part of, melding in our various roles, which is what Eddie Craybill had asked them to do, and which they had committed to do." He said, "What we want you to do is to give us some trouble. Be pushing up against us. Make it so it's not just I'm adding words to this, but push against us. Have these groups have a say about what they want their government to be like, and get them involved." And so I thought about putting together this kind of, in my own campaign for the Senate and for the Congress. Of course, we had no paid staff. We had to go out there and get these grassroots people together. I had formed an environmental group before I ran for office, the Friends of the Watchung, in order to stop a highway. And so I knew something about organizing this level of interest in a public issue of importance. So that was not something that I was being asked to do that I'd never had any experience with. The challenge then of going around and finding out what was the leadership, titular or otherwise, for various kinds of organizations, whether they were environmental or ethnic or trade-oriented, became how we set up these various groups. I had a significant assistance from law students, and Jeffrey Ketterson, who came to the governor's office, subsequently was my co-chair, and he had the line into lots and lots of law students because he had gone to law school here and I had not. So we had these kinds of, the usual suspects, which all the lawyers are always part of somebody's political campaign. Can't help it, bears and honey or something like that. But then these other groups that came along, whether they were ethnic or the sparklers, so that we had artists and celebrities interested, because again, that's also part of the show business side of campaigning and what makes it fun and interesting to people to be part of.
Were there any groups that you remember that were special targets to try to swing them to Brendan Byrne's side?
Well, there were people that on the ethnic side, Portuguese, the Ironbound, places where there were enclaves of people that probably had been underrepresented, but were very, very important, stabilizing parts of a city, and an important Hispanic approach And then that's when you realize that there's no such thing as a single Hispanic. That there are divisions within all of these groups and different kinds of leaderships, and getting them to come together about something that was important became kind of the art form. And then there were people that had been in Brendan Burns. Buddy Bianchi is a good example of the Italian community, people that had worked with him in the prosecutor's office. So, you know, he had a really broad range of people that he already knew. They were coming on a personal basis, and that was, some of it was politically oriented, but much of it was on a personal basis.
And how did these groups relate? I assume it varied, but did they give you sort of a wish list of we want A, B, and C for the candidate to support, or was it more subtle, or was it more personal in terms of just meeting and greeting and trying to get to know each other?
There was very little of that, here's my list. They were interested in his position on certain issues, but one of the things that I learned very early on, and that was, I think, the signature of that campaign and all the other campaigns, was that if anybody ever told me that Brendan Byrne had promised them something, I knew that was not so. He did not promise anybody anything. This position, that position, if I managed to give you this much money, this is, you know, what I want. That wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. At least, certainly not anything I ever heard about in all the years I was involved with that administration or those campaigns. So that there was a freedom of, if you make a good case, if it's the thing that's in the best interest of the state, I'm sure that he will be listening to you. That you are being part of this campaign will make it more likely that he'll have an opportunity to hear you. And there was at that time at least this thing of that this is where you wanted to be. You wanted to be part of this. It was exciting. This was not just this is what the county chairman wanted, and you had to go to these dreadful events and the mayor's birthday party. I never knew that some mayors could have that many birthdays, but anyway.
And you mentioned several people in the campaign. Who were the others that you remember?
Well, I remember Tom Byrne and Robert Torricelli. And Tom was running one of the youth groups, so he was part of my group, and Bob was helping him. So that's the first time that I started to work with Bob Torricelli and with Tom Byrne, who both, of course, have gone on to very distinguished areas of law and politics and public service. But I knew them when they were, I don't know, 20 years old. And the excitement that they brought to the campaign, and other young people that were able to come in, and of course Bob was doing work with university students. Tom was still at Princeton at the time, and all of Brendan's kids were all involved one way or another coming into the campaign. Herb Wolf, who was the press secretary, and that's also when I started to know more about Dick Leone and Lou Caden.
Of course, Alan Sagner came in at some point to head the financial fundraising.
Right. I had almost nothing to do with that, other than to be sure that my group, or if I was traveling with, if it was my day to travel or somebody else's day to travel, be sure and look out for X, Y, and Z, and they'll be there and greet them, and dealing with the advance people, so that the governor was as prepared as he could be to the environment he would be going into, and our advance team was really excellent. They were, they'd had a lot of experience, and so, that kind of comfort to the candidate is just invaluable.
Why don't we take a break? Jerry, before we broke, you were talking about your role in the 73 campaign dealing with local community and ethnic groups. What was Brendan Byrne like when he met with these groups? Did he try to tailor his message to their special interests or background?
Oh, I think he made that effort. I mean, that was part of what he was supposed to be doing there, and to make it as clear as one could that they would be, that the campaign was inclusive, that it was moving away from a hierarchical county leader situation, which frankly did not, attract everybody, particularly suburban people that had distrust of the old urban coalitions, and so I think he was making that effort, and of course he was learning. He was learning as well about how life had moved on, I think, from the time of Minor, which was completely hierarchical. And also the change because television was then much more important, which didn't exist in his time. With Governor Minor, it was radio oriented, and that was about it.
Let's move to primary election night. What was that like? Where were you?
Oh gosh, I was certainly there. That part I would remember. But I can't tell you that I have a particular memory of that particular night.
Did you feel a sense of relief? Was there still a feeling, well, maybe we shouldn't be as confident as we are going into this primary election?
Well, anyone that says it's a lock has never been there. It's never a lock, and but you also get euphoria within any campaign that how could we not win? I mean, look at all the great endorsements that we've gotten. Look at all of the quote opinion molders, makers, and they think well and highly of this person. The theme of the man who couldn't be bought had an awful lot of cachet. And I think that was, that of course was the simplistic way of describing who this person was. But again, any time that there has been, I think we now know more about, a time of loss of confidence in government because of corruption, real or perceived, then that coin of the realm is so important. And he had it.
Now that the primary is held, surprisingly, on the Republican side, Congressman Sandman is the winner. What was your personal reaction when Congressman Sandman becomes the Republican nominee for the general election?
Well, somewhat, first of all, astonishment. But now, now we know a little more about, I think, the what happens to the dedicated voter and the dedicated voter in both polarized circumstances for the parties. The left, the right come out, and moving toward the center is what they're all going to be doing in the general election. But for some reason or another, the Republican Party determined to find a very right-wing candidate and someone who was very closely attached to the Nixon administration, and by that time Watergate was a reality.
Did you feel with Congressman Sandman's nomination that Brendan Byrne was now a lock for the general election, or did you still have some feeling of doubt as to the result?
Well, you always have doubt, but I thought it was a lock.
And do you think that feeling was generally shared among the other key Byrne people?
I think so. I think so. I'm not sure that we ever had that kind of, directed conversation. But certainly the excitement that went on, the ability to bring people in. Yeah, there was also a North Jersey and a South Jersey view of these matters. 609, as the area code, was another state of mind, but it didn't have the population. And so that keeping the North Jersey part together, and they're very different communities even today. Charlie Sandman, to my knowledge, did not have a presence in throughout the state, and he was not somebody that just everybody knew Charlie. He was, by that point, I mean, he had served in the legislature, as I recall, but he'd been in Washington for some time, so he was not a household name in the state any longer. If it had been Governor Cahill, that might have been a very different issue.
As the Byrne campaign plans for the general election, was there some concern among the insiders who were there during the primary campaign that all these new people are going to be brought in and our roles may be weakened or compromised? Was there that feeling of potential jealousy as the campaign organization becomes larger, and also given the fact that Brendan Byrne looked like he was going to be a winner?
Well, I'm sure that there were those kinds of issues. I was not high enough in the hierarchy to be, concerned about that, beyond seeing that things went along in the way that they should go along. That doesn't mean that there were not fireworks that were going on internally, or that people always had a better idea about what should be done. But I don't recall a great deal of that.
Did your role change much during the general election compared to the primary election?
No.
So you were still dealing with the community and ethnic groups,
right,
for the most part?
Right.
Now, one of the statements that Brendan Byrne made during that general election campaign, which came back a little bit later to haunt him, was that he didn't see the need for an income tax, quote, in the foreseeable future, close quote. Do you remember when he said that and what your reaction was when you heard about it or read about it?
Well, if I told you today that, of course, I knew that the foreseeable future was going to be a lot more foreseeable than anyone thought. I guess it was part of my own naivete that I didn't believe that anybody wouldn't just say outright, well, of course you need an income tax. Well, what are you talking about? And that was the sort of thing that an Anne Klein would have been saying in the primary. Well, don't be ridiculous. Of course this is what we need. That I got to live through subsequently the rehashing and the rediscussion of that particular issue was for years and years and years. But it was a politically cautious thing to say.
Do you, after these many years, think that was a mistake? Do you think he should have come out more directly and said the state needs an income tax, given the fact that he seemed to be a sure winner in the general?
No, I don't. I mean, we now have some examples of people being intellectually honest that should have been elected, and because they forecast what they were going to do, they never got the opportunity to do what was required for the fiscal integrity of the state. So what goes on in campaigns and what people say in campaigns, always a grain of salt.
What are your other memories of the general election campaign?
A growing sense that, yes, we were going to win. Yes, there were serious things that were going to be done as a result, and that the first opportunity that the administration had, that it would have a platform, and that would be acted on, and that would be ready to go as soon as possible.
Now, in your role in dealing with the local organizations and groups, were many of them lobbying for the need for a broad-based statewide tax, or was it not an issue on the top of the agenda?
It was not. That wasn't really the role of these people. They were there as to show popular support for a person of integrity and credibility, and someone that made them feel good to be associated with.
Who were the key people that you can remember now from those organizations that you had any dealings with?
Well, Buddy Bianchi in particular, from the Italian community, and I can't say his name for the moment, from the Portuguese community. And then, of course, I have made, my famous plumbers for, and any kind of group I could think of that would be some organized group of people. But in terms of the heavy union people, Joel Jacobson was very important with UAW, and Charlie Marchianti. You were never sure where Charlie was when we were another.
We'll talk a little bit about the position of organized labor at the time and Charlie Marchianti's special role in his rather rocky relationship with Brendan Byrne in subsequent years.
Well, intellectually and politically, and in terms of issues, the UAW had always been the most progressive, along with the embroiderers and the needleworkers. Those progressive unions, there was an easy fit, and the kinds of things that the party was pushing and was going to push through this candidate and through the people that we were able to elect. Well, that was very, very positive, and that was the substantive part of where the campaigns were starting to I think, get their ideas. We also, of course, had a very important intellectual group of people that were helping to mold where government should be going and what was needed and what wasn't already there, what needed to be improved. So those kinds of figures became very, very important of the go-to person. If we go to this meeting, if we meet with your membership, what will be the positions that should be taken? If there's going to be a debate, what will be the key issues that the press will be looking at? What information are you able to get from these organized groups that are out there, number one, with policy positions, but number two, with an ability to deliver a vote on Election Day? So there was a very pragmatic aspect to certainly the organized labor aspect, which was, I think, in those days more powerful than it is now.
Did you see any improvement in Brendan Byrne's performance as a candidate on the stump during the general election from the early days of the primary?
Oh, yes. I mean, and for all I know, that it could have been totally put on. I barely know where I am and who these people are and why I'm here. Absolutely. When he became much more comfortable with the whole thing, and of course, he had some acting background, which we didn't know at the time either, and so he is I don't want to call him a ham, but he certainly started to enjoy the notoriety. He started to enjoy the celebrity that comes with that type of attention, and but I don't think he ever lost sight of how serious the the undertaking was and how exciting it would be to be able to do it.
Do you think he enjoyed the day-to-day campaign grind?
No, I think he thought that was dreadful. I mean, that was something, I'd have to get up and do that one more day, which is understandable. I mean, it's a lot of running around, and sometimes there's the right crowd there. Something that, and he was also a different face than what they were used to, meaning on the organized side. Number one, he didn't drink. He was bored at cocktail parties. He wanted to go to bed at 8 o'clock or 8:30 or something like that, and it would be our job to go into the whatever hall and explain to whoever was running the event that the governor-to-be wanted to speak first. Well, we can't do that. People are still coming in from work. They haven't had anything to drink. They haven't had anything to eat. Well, that could be, but we have to start at 6 o'clock. So that, he was not too malleable along those lines, that he had these certain disciplines, and by the way, stop everything because there's going to be a tennis game. Wait a minute. These people on national television or what have you, they want to interview you. Yeah, but about my tennis game or some other event of that nature, he didn't let too much get in the way of his own personal proclivities in that sense. Nonetheless, after a while, they all kind of, the people had said, well, hey, he's the candidate, and this is when he's going to speak, so we'll adjust to that. Didn't like it too much because they weren't used to that.
And I assume part of your role was to prepare briefings before each time he met with one of these groups about what their background was, who the key people were, what they were interested in. Did he do his homework? Did he read your briefings, and was he prepared when he went into these meetings?
It was hard to tell. And one of the things that was a great training event for me was that I would prepare the briefings, or someone would give me a briefing, and then I would read it. And the first thing he would do would be to take it away from me and then start asking me questions. But he had the briefing, so I learned to memorize pretty quickly because it was clear that I had to know what it was about, even though he had the material, and he might or might not read it.
Any anecdotes you recall during these meetings, fun things that happened or embarrassing things?
No, not really. I mean, just there were, and let me go back. I was a volunteer in this campaign, so that I was there during lunchtime. My law firm happened to be, not very far away, so I would go down during lunch from my firm and do the work I was supposed to do, and then it would be after work that I would then be around again for whatever event. But I was not traveling with them particularly. But I was helping with the groups, and of course on the weekends. Why then? All of us were volunteers.
Let's fast forward to election night. What was that like, and what was the mood among the campaign people?
Oh, well, the usual, the euphoria. This has been an important thing to be part of, and that is the sort of thing that I think attracts and should continue to attract people to the democratic process. That, you have ideas about things. You want to have a champion that will be believed in, that will lead people to these kinds of positive things for the society. Quite apart from that, it's a lot of fun. You meet all sorts of people. You talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about in your everyday life, and it's important. And I think that that's very attractive to people. So, election night, yay. The next morning, of course, is when everybody wakes up and says, oh, now we have to govern. Different issue.
Well, bring us, I guess, a little bit forward from that point. Day after election, what did you think? You had to make some personal plans as to what you did with your own career and life. Did you immediately think you would like to go in with the new administration?
No, that was never part of what I was thinking about during the time that I was working on the campaign. And then I went to a fundraiser that the governor gave for Anne Klein, because she had suffered a deficit in running for her. And first of all, I thought that was a very classy thing to do. And I went to this meeting in Morris County, a breakfast or something like that, and paid my money. And Governor-to-be came up to me and said, "How come you haven't called me?" And I said, "It never occurred to me to call you." And he gave me the name of his scheduler and said, "Please call." So I did, but the scheduler wasn't really thrilled, I have to tell you, to say, "Oh, do I have to work you in too?" "Yes, kid, you do," because he asked. So that was the first time that it even occurred to me that there would be something that that I could do or would be asked to do in his administration.
Well, I assume that meeting did get scheduled.
It did.
What happened?
It did get scheduled, and I thought to myself, as long as I'm here, I might as well ask for something. So I said, "How about DCA? I don't even know what it does, but how hard could that be? A bunch of mayors. Just sounds like another interest group."
Department of Community Affairs.
That's right. I mean, why not that? I could be commissioner of that, I suppose. Bold in that I knew absolutely nothing about it. And he did mention that he thought he probably would like to have a mayor do that. And of course, Patty Sheehan was part of the campaign and somebody that I had very high regard for. And then he said to me, "How would you like to be counsel?" And then he told me his problem. And his problem was that Lou Caden was going to be his counsel, but Lou Caden was not a member of the New Jersey bar. And he thought that this might cause him some trouble in just dealing on a day-to-day basis with what he had to deal with, or that kind of perception that the press might get a big kick out of. So then he said, "Well, how about legislative counsel?" Because Lou had no experience. No one in the staff that he was pulling on had any experience with the legislature. And of course, I had been a state senator and counsel to the minority. So I could go on the floor of the Senate and into the Assembly, which subsequently turned out to be a good thing.
How quickly did you say yes?
Not that quickly. I mean, I was a partner in a firm. I had to make, this was probably happened in late November, early December. And the administration would take effect in the middle of January.
Did you talk to anyone else other than Brendan Byrne about the job?
I talked to my senior partner in particular, and he said I would be very I would be sad that you left the firm, but you would kick yourself if you didn't take the opportunity. And so I took that very seriously and said, "Okay, I'll do it."
Jerry, before we broke, we had gotten to the transition. You met with the governor-elect. He asked you to join the governor's office staff as legislative counsel. What happened next? You did sort of talk with your senior partner at your law firm and decided, I assume, to take the job. But what were the other memories you have of the transition period?
Well, there were, there were transition meetings going on with various departments, and I don't recall much about that beyond saying I knew that there were transition papers being prepared, and then there was a discussion about what it was that was going to happen once the legislature convened. The most important part was really to be able to have a legislative program that started right away. That, you know, the first 100 days, which is kind of always magic, allegedly, in the time in which administration gets to show itself. And being able to have those bills ready, being able to have a very, very forceful, we just got elected and boy, we're not wasting any time. Ironically, and perhaps also for those kinds of things that happen that you don't quite expect, is that some of us on the very first day of going to work, we're going to have some trouble getting there because we didn't have any gasoline for our cars. So it was, how am I going to get to work? It was the time of the first shortages and
Arab oil embargo.
Yes, and so that's when having an energy office became very, very important. And Joel Jacobson was part of that. Another former state senator was heading it, and I'm just having a lapse for the moment. But he was a Republican senator, and so that, you know, after I managed to find somebody in the council's office who was part of the Cahill organization, and that was being kept on. Once I found out that I could carpool with him for a while, was very helpful, plus the fact that he would kind of explain to me a lot of things about how things worked in the council's office and what they did.
You remember who that was?
Jim Heaney.
Jim Heaney.
Who has been a long time in government.
In general, were the Cahill people helpful in the transition?
Oh yes, extremely, extremely. And that was also a very important lesson to everyone that the worst thing you could do is to make sure that everyone who knows anything is gone. You know, let's have the people around who are an archive, who have been there, who have been working on some matters that bring you up to date on at least recent history. And of course that is terribly important as you go really into the bureaucracy of government, quite apart from the people who are there, who are hired on for the job, not for life.
Any other thoughts about that transition period? Were there obvious sort of jockeying for jobs? Were there people who were really lobbying for positions?
Oh, I'm sure there were.
But not that you saw.
But I was not. Other than the people that I really wanted to have, you know, I was permitted to bring some people on. So I brought my own secretary, for instance, who elected to leave the firm and to come with me. Jeff Ketterson was given a position. I found an opportunity for Bob Torricelli, but I told him that he had to stay in law school full-time and work for me full-time, that he couldn't leave law school in order to work for me. Which he did. And then watching, you know, these people that were going to work for you that you not necessarily ever worked with before was an interesting part. Actually, when we got there, we began to find out a couple of truisms, and that is that while the Republicans could buy furniture, but the Democrats had to depreciate it. You could never have any new equipment or new desks or new anything. And then the office that you and I ultimately shared had those silk curtains from Woodrow Wilson's day that are so light-struck that they were all falling apart. And I never was going to touch them because I thought they were so incredible. But I didn't have an office or a desk that was mine, so I shared the desk with Tom O'Neill. So we would send out memos that said things like, "From the desk of Tom and Jerry." We had one phone until finally, I don't know, a few weeks into the operation, I was going out to lunch, and the governor was going out with somebody or another. He says, "How are things?" And I said, "Not so good." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I don't have a desk. I have a phone." And frankly, other than the honor, I didn't say I am threatening to leave, but I was showing a little kind of, this is not what I intended to do. The next day, I had the old Woodrow Wilson office. And the state police came in to, get rid of any listening equipment that might be in there, which had never even occurred to me. So they were in there, and Chief Justice Hughes came in to call on me. And right in the middle of, he wanted to smoke, and I found an ashtray. And right in the middle of this ashtray was this upturned dead bug. And I thought, well, that's what they're in here doing. So there were these bizarre things that were going on of just setting up the place, like, do you have a place to sit? Meanwhile, you're working. But, was it functional? Did anybody care about that? And Don Land, who was then the executive secretary to the governor, didn't believe in spending any money on anything unless he was absolutely forced to. So at least Tom O'Neill and I got our own phone and didn't have to say, "Hold on while I hand the phone to the other person and run in the other room and get him." So those were the kinds of parts that were, welcome to government. Welcome to the public sector, where you will have a lot of excitement, but please don't expect to have too many creature comforts or the things that one might expect from a big-time operation.
Now, as you developed that legislative program that you hope to move quickly after the inauguration, who were the sort of key people who were advising and writing, I assume, drafts of these bills, or at least trading ideas about what that program should be?
Doubtless numbers of people, but Lou Caden was the point at which the legislation really did, line by line. Dave Goldberg was certainly helpful on parts of this. The existing staff were parts of this, and on the fiscal sides. And I think Dick Leone was always part of the political think of where they had to be going and the revenue side of where they had to be going. But on the day-to-day bills going through, Lou Caden and his staff were the ones that were doing the actual drafting of most of the things. I would get it in the areas in which they thought I could be particularly helpful, and do markups of add this, put this part in, and to the part that would also come to me would be to bounce off who should be, in fact, the ones that were going to be the ones to sponsor the bills. Which house should they be going in? Who should be the key sponsors? Who would be able to carry the bill through? The committee structure was much less sophisticated. They had very little staff in the legislature on either side. They had the Sam Alito seniors, a partisan staff, to draft bills for them, meaning for the legislators. But the governor's bills were the ones that always had the prominence. They were always the ones that were on the governor's agenda, and hopefully the bills that were going to be the major centerpieces of the administration.
And since Brendan Byrne had run as the man who couldn't be bought, and I guess later the label of government under glass, I assume that much of the sort of attention of that early legislative program was directed toward open government, anti-corruption, that type of thing.
Absolutely. That's, I think, the reasoning behind having the 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 gubernatorial election, the public funding of gubernatorial elections was his very first bill. That also included the public advocate. So that there were these two parts of this. Anyone who can get a grassroots approach to their candidacy, doesn't have to be a self-financing individual, would have an opportunity to run. And of course, for someone, he came from that very background of someone who had been in public service most of his adult career. And then the public advocate being the watchdog inside government, somebody that would have the opportunity to sue someone, to sue a department, to say, you're not doing your job. Here's where you're falling apart. That kind of following along with the legislative intent, following to keep a program on course, to keep it from going off. That one was pretty unique, and as I recall, first in the nation, not replicated too many places, except maybe in a comptroller's role or something of that nature, or oversight, for instance, in the Congress. But those kinds of roles did not exist in the state, at least at that time.
And of course, with Brendan Burns' landslide victory in November, many new Democrats also got elected to the legislature. The advantage is you have very large majorities, but as most political scientists say, when you have those large majorities, they're very difficult to control and to discipline. How did you sort of see that in your relationship with the legislature and with the legislative leadership? Was it somewhat an unwieldy role to keep these people in line?
Well, let's just say it was, challenging. That old Russian proverb, easier to take care of one woman than a bag of fleas. When people come in that fashion, there are some delusional aspects of it, which is, I got here on my own. I owe no allegiance to anyone. I don't have to do anything that you tell me to do because the people love me and they will return me no matter what happens to you. Well, there may be some truth to that, but I wouldn't hold my breath about it because if it goes the other way around and the head of the ticket is vastly unpopular, and we have just seen some of that happen in our national elections, then people that really, we're doing a pretty good job, you just got swept along. So events overtake. At the same time, I think it was very helpful to me to have worked with the legislators in advance. I knew them. The new people who came in, I made a great effort to try and get to know as quickly as possible, to appreciate their abilities, and in many instances, of course, they had come from districts where they had never really elected Democrats before. So they were tended to be pretty idealistic. And then after a while they started to really like it and say, oh, well, I really would like to get elected again. Maybe I'll become a little more conservative as times go along. And with all of us, there is sometimes, that thing of, well, the sun certainly couldn't get up today unless I was out there helping it. And some of those illusions, would strike some of them from time to time. But that's when the leadership worked on everybody. That's when the role of the governor, that's when the governor's cabinet, that's when the advisors become critical to explain the program, to show how it's important to the state, how it will enhance their careers because they've done something that was important to the state. And for those who were bold enough to say, this is worth my not getting reelected again. Those were fairly rare instances, but they did happen.
In those early days after Brendan Burns' inauguration, how was the mechanics of the relationship with the legislature and the legislative leadership in particular handled? Were there regular meetings with the leadership? What were those meetings like, and sort of give us a feel for the dynamics?
Before every legislative session, there was a meeting in the governor's office with the legislative leadership to go over the bills. And these would be typically just the Democratic leadership, to go over the bills, what we hoped would get passed that day, what we needed to have in an extraordinary measure, which was always difficult because there is a legislative process of how many times a bill has to be read, whether it's out of committee, how much time there is between those events. And only in emergencies can you change that, and that's with a supermajority sort of vote. Many of the people that came into government with Brendan Byrne were also, however, new to government. So they weren't part, and Alan Sagner had never been part of government before. Joel Jacobson hadn't been part of government before. Others might have been involved in some of them had been in the legislature, like Ann Klein. Others had never been there, except that they were the people that were key people in the campaigns, and were going to be continuing to be looked upon for advice with their particular sector of expertise. So you'd have those meetings, and the council that had helped work on the bill and what have you would usually be dispatched with the leadership to go to the caucus if they were invited to explain the bills, because once the leadership left, then they would go off to the caucus, the party caucus, where they would discuss the bills, try to get a sense of whether or not they had the votes. And then that became the job of my group on a legislative day, to track the bill, to see where it was going, see what the problems were, see what amendments were being insisted upon. And those were very, very long days. They'd start early, and then, they would conclude sometimes far into the night. And if they were matters of big importance, then it would just keep going on and keep going on. And then there would be adjournments. There would be times when you thought somebody was on board, and then they would have an epiphany of something that was really important and would start to balk, and then you'd have to drag them into the governor's office to have a little chat, to realign their thinking back to at least neutrality. And but the other thing that happened was that the senior legislators, like Eddie Craybill, were no longer in the leadership. So we had new leadership in the legislative ranks. So they hadn't done this before either. So Pat Dodd became the head of the Senate, for instance. Eddie was the Secretary of State. Eddie would occasionally go down on a bill, be an example of something that was, again, a respected voice, someone that they knew, someone that understood all of the parties. But there was a new leadership aspect as well.
We'll talk a little bit more about some of the other leaders who were there, again, in these early days of the administration. What were their personalities like, their styles?
Well, of course, Pat Dodd was this elegant person who was a very dashing figure, and a very, was kind of, the bachelor type that everybody really wants to be, beautifully dressed, very charming, and with a pretty good staff, and people who were working hard some of the people had been around before. And then there was Howard Woodson, who was the first black speaker in the history of the state, and he had been a very distinguished, and what continued to be a very distinguished minister and pastor of a very large church in Trenton. And of course, he had come from one of the premier black universities in the South. Always elegantly put together. And when things got difficult, and people were getting a little difficult in the ranks, I would watch him start to sway, and then he'd start to preach. And it would be kind of like this metronome, and everyone would get calmed down, and then they could do business again. But he was always the sort of person that was used to listening to people's personal problems, and brought a very human, a human side to the legislature, and getting them to work together as much as they were really wanting to maybe hit each other, instead coming out and presenting the best face.
Now, fairly shortly after Brendan Byrne takes office, your plans on the legislative agenda and sort of the focus of the administration get diverted somewhat, because it's determined that the state's finances are in such bad shape that something has to be done quickly. What was your reaction, I guess, when you were advised of this sort of new change in priorities?
Well, I remember Dick Leone saying to me, well, maybe we can get it done. That was not the most ringing. That was not the most ringing. It's just no problem. Just go in there and put that bill in. I think it probably was more to my naivete and less to his about how difficult that was going to be. But that's when we all got the crash course in how much government costs. I mean, how much any of us really knew about how much it cost to run the state and what each department depended on, and what they were required to do. And of course, those budgets seem so achievable today versus what they are today. But we still had a balanced budget constitutional requirement. So this is something that certainly Governor Byrne understood extremely well from his times with Governor Minor, who was legendarily frugal. I think that may be the best way to place that he was very frugal. And so government was run on a pretty tight string. As soon as that came up, I did not expect, initially, the firestorm that eventually took place, or the duration of it. But we had some extraordinary people in the legislature who it wasn't as if nobody had ever talked about it before. The Cahill Commission had already been there. They already knew that this is what, serious students of government and the people who were in the legislature knew that this was going to come up, was going to have to be dealt with. And the first budget that they were going to try and cut, by the way, I'll never forget that the first thing that the Treasury Department group decided that they would cut were funds to the to some group that desperately needed blood. Well, if you could imagine what that response was, which was very emotional, and just the wheelchairs were going to start lining up. You began to find out that the politics were very particular, and they were very particular to every single group. And of course, that sort of scene is reenacted on differing scales over and over. So it turned out to be a lot tougher and a lot longer than I anticipated to begin with. And we had a relatively early victory in the Assembly. And, you know, so the Assembly voted, we got it, no problem now, we just turn it over to the Senate. Well, not so fast.
Well, before we get to that
Yeah.
point, I'm still curious about the initial reactions of the legislative leaders and other legislators that you had contact with when you first told them, well, we have to put a tax package through, even though we didn't run on this, that Brendan Byrne a few months ago said he didn't see the need for. What was their reaction?
I don't remember it being all that shocked. I mean, I think they were realists, but I didn't hear too many, oh yes, don't worry your pretty little head about this. You know, you just give me my orders and, you know, I'll get it done.
Among the Democrats, who were the most difficult people to get on board?
Well, it differed. It differed from time to time. We always had the most fun with Kenny Gewurz, or as the governor would say, we're going from bad to Gewurz, because yes, he'd be there, no, he wouldn't be there, and he always had a pretty good reason. But you know, you weren't going to go to the bank that he was going to be where he told you he was at 8 o'clock in the morning. Where he was later on was another thing. That I don't want to pick him out as being the only person that would be like that. But then somebody would say, if I do this, you know, we have to go back to the seminal issue, and that was that the Supreme Court was an actor in this review, because they had set the stage about what the state had to do in order to comply with thorough and efficient, so that there was a compunction. There was a stick there to kind of say, by the way, this is not a volunteer act. You're under the compunction of law to respond, legislature. And there were some that took that extremely seriously. And then there were others that would say to me, do you really think that the Supreme Court is going to put us all in jail? So, you know, between those two things, and then there would some that would just say politically, look, hey, folks, if it was up to me, I wouldn't be doing this, but it's for the school children, and the Supreme Court has said that every child must be properly funded. So this is the only way to do it, unless you want to have a 15% sales tax. I made that up. You know, unless you want us to stop having the kind of sales tax that we have, which is pretty benign, to one that's the only kind of thing that there is, or a statewide property tax. And income tax is the fairest.
And let's go back to where I sort of stopped you before. The bill does get passed by the Assembly. Were you confident then that you could get the Senate to also pass the bill?
In hindsight, yes, confident. In hindsight, couldn't have been more wrong. And we had to go through a long drought.
Well, talk about that process and the various players who were key in that Senate vote.
That's when, you know, the skill of people like Dick Leone, Cliff Goldman, Dave, and Luke Hayden really came to the fore. Eddie Craybill. The people who really were working all of those angles. That's when we had to be starting pulling in the county chairman to assure them that their people would get reelected. That's when we had to start pulling out all the stops of all the good government groups, of all of those actors that one would hope would be behind what the state had to do in order to have a fair tax system, and to pull that burden off of the property tax, and have everybody understand that it wasn't going to the state coffers. So there was an education process that had to go on there that took a long time. getting the newspapers to understand what was going on. There's a media campaign, and everybody was running for election in the middle of it, which is always the case. So it was the stand-up people remained stand-up, the ones who said, yes, Governor, we will pass this bill. But it was not an easy lift for them at any time. And other things would get held up. I mean, you know, if you want my vote on X, then you've got to do this on Y. Governor did not play that game. He was not. He did not sit up nights to try and be super friendly to the legislature. This is when he would get difficult. I want you to talk to X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to talk to him. And by the way, I want senatorial courtesy not to be exercised, and I'm going to go behind them and get this done without the committee. Now, those kinds of things would, of course, set chills in my spine.
Well, did you try to argue with him that he should be a little bit more forthcoming?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, come on. You know, I need 5 minutes. He's desperate to see you, and it's probably not about this at all. He's got something else on his mind, and, you know, he'll want to say to you, would you please just give my brother-in-law a job at the car wash or whatever. That was not part of my job, by the way. That's what Harold got to do. So I never had any of the patronage side. I had the boards and commissions that were volunteer boards and commissions. I had the judges, the prosecutors. Those were my line jobs, quite apart from the legislation. But, you know, in working with the legislature, everybody always had something that they were interested in doing. And all they needed to be able to say was to whomever the group was or the individual, I talked with the governor about it. No guarantee that it was going to come out the way they wanted, but I talked to the governor about it, which gave them, of course, the status of importance and continuing appearance of influence and access to the governor, about which there is no more important thing if you're in public life, to be able to go to the real decision maker and to talk with the key staff. And sometimes there's only so much, you know, so many hours in the day, because meanwhile you're still running the government. I mean, this is not the only thing that's going on. The government has still got to be being run. There are still projects and programs and things that the governor has to put his attention to, putting together a realistic budget, getting judges appointed, getting the revenues in the door, maintaining a pretty sophisticated system of governance, which in hindsight and in presently I think we have.
Looking back with the benefit of so many years to think about it, in that first Senate vote, do you think it would have made any difference if Brendan Byrne had been a little bit more hands-on in dealing directly with individual senators?
It might have been. It might have been. What you were trying to do is to have someone rise above their personal ambitions and say, this is why I got elected. And some people were capable of that, and others just couldn't face it, or thought that they would be drummed out, never heard of again. And that was very important to them.
And I guess at least one or two thought that Brendan Byrne was aloof, would sort of look down upon them.
Well,
do you think that was a fair rap? Or?
Not only that he was aloof, but that he also had a cadre of people around him who were aloof, and who disdained them and didn't think they were very bright, had very little regard for their abilities.
Well, some people during the course of these interviews have supported that position. What's your own take on it?
Oh, I think that was some of the feeling. That certainly I would get the complaints. And I would have to say that at least because I had been part of the legislature beforehand and I knew some of the people, that I think that I probably heard more of it and then would try and work it around so that it wasn't quite so irritating. But some people will, always take offense when what they're being told is the bald truth and there's not too much icing on it, or there's nothing in it for them except downsides. And in this context, you also begin to find out about the strengths of the people that are delivering the message. Somebody like Lou Caden, who, to me, I don't think I've ever met anyone who understood the rhetoric of the policy and then how to implement it as well as Lou did. Then, of course, his very substantial career in the private sector has followed that. But he was such a clear. He had a human face on how to go about doing something, and if you could get him to talk in that way to people, he was very, very convincing and was very, very good. And I think the staff only worked about 24 hours a day for him. And continued to reach out for his advice years after he was no longer in government.
But of course, Lou Caden, Dick Leone, Cliff Goldman, yourself, Brendan Byrne, all had pedigrees educationally and so forth that for most of the legislators may have been a little intimidating or even off-putting. Most of the key people had Ivy League backgrounds, and a lot of the legislators were from blue-collar backgrounds. Did that have any impact, do you think, some sort of class distinction?
Oh, it may have, but it wasn't palpable to me. And it wasn't something that certainly that I thought about. I was always interested in these people, in all of these people, and found some remarkable things about them. So they were interesting to me. Now, they may not have been interesting to everybody. On the other hand, I had to deal with them, but I had the privilege of dealing with them. And so I would find out about their personal lives. I would find out about their districts because I'd campaigned in the districts. I think I had more of a sense of who they were really talking about. And the ones who had come out of this fluke of an election were, they were at peril. So could they stay on? Were they going to be able to stay there? Would it have been helpful if there had been a little more, care and attention? Nobody ever has enough care and attention. So certainly that would have helped. Would it have produced a different vote? I don't think so.
What do you recall of those sort of final days as the Senate gets down to making a decision one way or another? Who were the key targets? What were the meetings like? How long did they last?
The meetings were endless. The hours were endless. The negotiating of the changing of bills, even to a little bit, that's when somebody like, again, Cliff Goldman would come in and know the numbers to a dime, explain them extremely well. Cliff was one of the people that I think that most of the legislators felt very comfortable with, because he had an academic ability to put things in very simple terms. And he didn't talk down to people. He worked so hard to make it understandable, so that if they had a chance to actually spend the time with him, then they would have been able, as they were required to do, was to go out and explain to somebody else what was going on and why they did what they did. So Cliff was one of the good examples of taking a very difficult issue and explaining it district by district and exactly what it meant. and how that district was going to benefit.
Who were the swing votes that you recall?
Charlie, what was the name of the guy? The independent gentleman who sat in the middle of the aisle, and I just can't say, he came out of the Ironbound district. Sorry, I just can't say.
Tony Imperiale?
Yes. We just had nightmares with people like him, because of course he was his own kind of very independent individual, very idiosyncratic. You know, to this day I can't remember how he voted. I just remember that we spent hours and hours and hours with him.
What about on the Republican side? Who were the people that you hoped to bring over?
Well, you could always count on Ray Bateman. You could always count on a Frank McDermott. You could always count on the people that had already been there once and survived. But Ray Bateman is the one in particular that I think was key. And he was, he'd been on the Blue Ribbon Commission. He'd already, he was on record.
How about Wayne Dumont?
You know, Wayne, of course, was Mr. Education, and a lifelong, practically, legislature, very, very difficult about certain items, including Cooser Mansion, which I think was part of his family's heritage or something, and he always was hassling me about Cooser Mansion. You know, unless I saw the vote in front of me today, I couldn't tell you where he was, but he would be the kind of person that would be open to an intellectual discussion, and he wasn't going to get thrown out of office.
Well, as it comes down to it, you aren't able to get the votes in the Senate. What was the feeling? Just total depression, or how did you take it?
Well, of course, it was very depressing, and there was no going away from it. I mean, there you were. And for many people, you know, people like myself, we didn't get asked to a lot of dinner parties. I mean, this polarized just real people. And you could either go someplace and find yourself in the middle of a very unpleasant evening with people that were outraged that such a thing was going to be even considered. Then after a while, you began to pick out the 3 or 4 people that you could see without being, you know, personally attacked. So that was, of course, depressing. But nonetheless, hey, just keep trying.
Now that you've lost that first battle over the income tax and the school reform package, how did you sort of restructure your priorities? Did you go back to the sort of early agenda of the clean government, public finance, accountability program?
I don't think we ever strayed from that. I mean, that was one of the things that I think was a hallmark of the administration. And finally, when the governor was running for re-election, and the slogan was, "You have to respect him for what he did," that signature remained. And in his appointments, certainly to the judiciary, in his appointments to boards and commissions, in his selection of good people to run the major departments of government, I kind of left that part out, and I shouldn't have, because there was at that time, you know, people of such talent that wanted to be part of government. They wanted to come and be the $1 a year person, or to give up their law profession, or to give up their other career, or get a leave of absence, because they knew this was going to be an exciting time, and they wanted to be part of it, and they wanted to be associated with someone whose character was one that they were comfortable with, and that was not just a all the political hacks of the world convention. So it was a time for really gifted people to come into government, and that may in fact be one of the more lasting effects of his administration.
Now, the tax issue gets revived later in the administration, and either rightly or wrongly, I guess the legislature, at least key people in the legislature, suggest that they take more of a lead now in developing a program. Was that your read of it, or was it sort of a behind-the-scenes strategy of the Byrne administration to say, look, we sort of got our head handed to us the last time, and it might be better for them to look like they're taking more of an initiative this time around?
Well, however it really turned out, I think that's what happened. I mean, whether it was some sort of divine intervention, I don't think, but certainly by that time everybody knew one another a little better too. You know, you knew who you could count on.
And of course the court is also getting a little bit more aggressive in terms of fixing a deadline and saying that
yes,
the legislature is not going to be able to push this
right
off forever.
And then you saw the real Brendan Byrne emerge when he decided that he was going to argue the case before the Supreme Court, which I don't think has ever happened since. And I doubt that it ever happened before, but I don't know. And so he was back in his old days of arguing as he did quite regularly before the Weintraub court. And that certainly set another kind of standard, which is if I really believe in this, I believe in it enough to have this very public display of the executive coming to the court to say, you have to enforce your order.
We'll talk somewhat about the relationship between the governors of New Jersey and the Supreme Court, not only the special, I guess, relationship that Brendan Byrne had with the Supreme Court, but in general. I mean, some commentators have suggested that it's almost too close a relationship, that the governor and the Supreme Court sort of gang up against the legislature. Is that your take as a lawyer and as a former key person in state government?
No, but I mean, I think there is a reality that sometimes the balance tilts toward the executive, especially when you have a part-time legislature. You have then not very robust staff, not very many people to actually do the bills. They would be dependent upon the executive for their information. So the holder of the information, at least in terms of governmental workings, is always with the executive. The relationship of the governors with the Supreme Court, of course, New Jersey, as everybody knows, has an appointed Supreme Court that has had national stature long before Brendan Byrne was elected. Coming from the Vanderbilt court, having one of its members go on the Supreme Court, Justice Brennan, and also another time of not the flood of litigation, very few cases as a practical matter, the time for those cases to be decided. And one of the personal things for me that I never expected was when the governor said, "Oh, and you'll do the judges and the prosecutors." I then was able to be part of the selection for the Supreme Court, and that's the time when I really started to know the justices. The governor had an annual dinner with them, and that was the only social occasion that was, that went on in that fashion, and it was like it was a social dinner. This was not a time when cases were discussed. I mean, no one would have ever considered discussing a case that was going to come before the court with any justice. But in terms of the kind of people that should be considered to become a Supreme Court justice, then those were the kinds of conversations one could have, and we did have.
Let's sort of get the income tax enacted and passed. I mean, some people have suggested in these interviews that although there was a feeling of accomplishment, it also very quickly became clear that politically this was going to be a very difficult issue to deal with as the administration and the governor moved toward another election. What was your own feeling when the income tax did get passed and the school package was enacted?
I thought that's what we were there to do. And so I didn't have any, I certainly expected re-election. Didn't think it would be easy. Thought we might lose some people. But, you know, that's what you signed on for. And staying the course, that's a term that sometimes has come into some disrepute. But that's what you were supposed the follow-up, the stability that this was supposed to put in place was why you went through all that. And it continued to show the integrity. I've used that term many times. Single-mindedness can sometimes be a difficult thing. So, you know, that's all I'm concerned about. That's all I'm paying attention to. There's no other way. I think that the administration became more flexible. It matured. Different people came in to head, you know, different departments. Not everybody was a terrific commissioner. Sometimes people left. Better people came. Worse people came. But the key people in government stayed. And New Jersey has a remarkable civil service. And you don't get to know that until you're actually there. And you get to work with these people that have had their careers there, who you just ask one question and they know the answer to it right away.
Well, before we move toward the re-election campaign, I wanted you to discuss in more depth your other roles as legislative counsel. You've mentioned briefly your role in the sort of review of potential nominees as judges and prosecutors. Talk about the mechanics of that and how the governor went about it.
Well, the first thing he did early in his campaign was to say that he would work with the New Jersey Bar Association and that he would send candidates to them for their review, and that for the most part he would honor their up or down about whether or not the Bar Association, which does not involve every lawyer in the state. It's a voluntary organization. But the committee was chaired by a man named William Dill, again a person of unquestioned integrity, credibility. And so he ran that committee. The part that happened for me that was just a wonderful experience was the governor had a close working relationship with a retired assignment judge of Essex County and subsequently of Morris, Sussex and Warren, Alexander P. Waugh, Sr., who was, in the old days when you thought about what a judge was like, he was a judge. And the first time he ever called me as a private lawyer, I stood up at my desk on the other end of the telephone, because he was the sort of person that commanded that sort of response. Of course, as I got to know him later on, I didn't stand up all the time, but mentally I always stood up. When he asked Judge Waugh to be the primary vetter of candidates, and they could come from any place. Somebody could send their own. I mean, that was part of the governor's view. If you want to be a judge, you let me know. Give me your resume. Give it to Mrs. English. County leaders, bar associations had their committees. So we would get the names of people and the resumes, and I would give them to Judge Waugh. He would then do the initial vetting, and he would call. In those days, it was more than likely that the lawyers would have appeared before the court at some point or another, somebody's court. There were not that many in-house people that were even, interested in such a position. Most of the people were litigating trial people. They were general practitioners for the most part. The assignment judge knew them. The bar was much smaller. Not only, as if I said 10,000 people, 10,000 lawyers, as opposed to 80 or 90,000 today. The good practitioners were well known. The assignment judge would talk to somebody like Judge Waugh because they knew that would be kept in confidence, and that he would then have a rating, and then he would be able to come in, talk with me. We would then look at the vacancies that were available, and it's a bipartisan court, as you know, and it had changed to a statewide jurisdiction by that point, although we were still in the middle of some district court elevations and things of that nature that happened in the course of the time, and I can't really remember exactly when. And then we would go to the governor with recommendations of people, and I, of course, before I got there, had to be able to say, yes, there will be a political clearance on this particular person from the senator that had the opportunity to block that nomination. And that became the really much more difficult part of the job. Because assuming you had, a really wonderful candidate that you couldn't believe that you could get to leave their practice and go on the bench, that had gone through the vetting, and then the senator would say, well, no, that's not my person, or there's something else that I want from you, Governor, before I release this individual. And that's an unwritten rule, as you know, in the Senate. It's not part of anything written down. It is their practice, and it is honored among them. It's very rare that anyone has ever stripped a senator of their courtesy. I think it may have happened once or twice, but that would be for some egregious reason. So sometimes we lost really good candidates. Other times it became challenging because the people were extremely well qualified, but they had no political credential whatsoever. And you would also often say, because you have political credentials doesn't mean that that you shouldn't be considered. If you've been interested in political life, well, good. That shouldn't be a discrediting thing. On the other hand, if you've never been involved in politics before, but you are really going to be a great judge, then it would be my job, along with others, to try and make sure that they made their calls. They wouldn't and called on the people that they should call on, including the senators. Tell them about their qualifications and their interest in serving in the court.
Did the governor interview each candidate?
Absolutely.
And what were the typical questions he would ask?
He would ask rather broad questions of the judges. He had different questions for the prosecutors. They were usually general questions. He didn't ask them anything about, a pending case or something of that nature. he would ask them about their experience, why they wanted to go on the court now. Did they believe that this was a calling for them? Try and get a sense of, were they bright people? Did they seem to be, again, people that that would fit that branch? Because, as we all know, the judges live on a lot longer than the governors do. And having that high caliber sitting in the judiciary is just absolutely critical to having a civil society.
Another role you had, as you've mentioned, was relating to the commissions and authorities. There were some fairly difficult times with at least a couple of the authorities, like the Port Authority, in which you later served on the board, and the Turnpike Authority, some of the others. Talk a little bit about the structure and about the politics of relating to these quasi-autonomous and sometimes fairly independent bodies.
That would be one in which the governor would have a very distinct interest in whether or not, why did the person want to be on this particular kind of board? What were they going to bring to it? Did they have some particular competence that was going to help make that board function properly? Some of them were paying boards, not a lot of money, but some of them were actually, they got a per diem allowance. Many others were purely voluntary, and I tended to deal more with the voluntary ones. If they were, that didn't mean that they didn't have to, if they had advice and consent of the Senate, that was a special role, and some of them did require that. Others were merely by the appointment of the governor, with potential appointments by the Speaker and the Senate President. So, there we had everything from the Asparagus Council, which was one of my great favorites, to the water authorities, the highway authorities, the Turnpike, the Garden State Parkway. Of course, the Port Authority was its own pretty unique institution, as was the Delaware River authorities, those ones that were bi-state. And the role that they played in terms of the economic ability of the state, the transportation nexus, those kinds of things, depending upon how important they were to the economic aspects of the state and its ability to function, versus a very discrete group of interests, had something to do with the kind of people that sought those kinds of jobs, or a trade association sought to place one of their people.
Do you remember any of the particular sort of incidents of conflicts between the governor's office and any of these commissions or authorities?
Oh yes, there were, certainly with the Port Authority. Governor Byrne was just death on any toll increase. He already had Alan Sagner as his former commissioner of transportation as the chairman, the president, the chairman. He'd appointed everybody, with minor exceptions, on the New Jersey side. He had good relationships with Governor Carey and Nelson Rockefeller. Not so good in the early times, because they were fighting over the executive director. By the time I got involved, much of that was past, but there were commissioners, for instance, that were sitting that were not particularly helpful, and so he would make a determination to go in a different direction, even though they weren't doing anything odious, but they were not necessarily doing what he thought New Jersey needed as its part of that compact. And that caused some hard feelings, too.
Of course, a lot of these appointments have some fairly important political figures who take the positions. During our interview with Lou Gambaccini, he said one of his only frustrations in the Byrne administration was the failure to be more aggressive in sort of getting control of the boards of like the Turnpike Authority.
Mm-hmm.
He said he could not quite understand why Brendan Byrne wasn't a little more aggressive in terms of getting control. What's your sort of view on that now?
Well, I remember having, conversations of my own to try and get the executive director of one of those authorities to say, well, wait a minute. The Secretary of Transportation, the Commissioner of Transportation, is the one with the overall responsibility. You all have to be on the same page here. This was like, what? That hadn't occurred to us. We could do whatever it is we want to do. We have our own sources of revenue. We get our tolls and we go on our merry way. So why should we have to talk to you? Well, that was when they started to have these different issues. The transit authority being passed to try and get these fiefdoms to even have the same gauge for the railroad, to have whether or not they're all going to be electrified or whether they're going to be something else. I mean, I'm sure that Lou discussed with you about, how disparate and how convoluted our transportation system was, because it all came out of private railroads that operated on their own, and then to a very aging and pretty bad news infrastructure that was left in the wake of that, without a modern system being put in place.
Apart from the income tax and the sort of program for a more open and accountable government, what other issues in the first term sort of stick in your mind so many years later now?
Well, as I say, the signature piece was the public financing. And although it was in the second term, the first part of it started in the first term, and that was the Spill Fund Act. There had been a huge oil spill in Santa Barbara. We were also talking about offshore drilling, or the Congress was talking about offshore drilling, and the companies were pushing toward offshore drilling. We had just come through this energy crisis. And the Spill Act was really there to begin with. We lifted that piece of legislation from California. It was really designed for, you'd have a tanker offshore. There would be a release, would come on shore, and it would cause problems and loss of wildlife and degradation of the beach area until it could get cleaned up, but there were no funds to do it, etc. So I think it was Senator Russo was the lead on that particular bill, and we added to it, almost as an afterthought, toxic waste. It was kind of, and as long as we're at it, we might as well throw that in. Well, of course, that became the tail wagging the dog. It was the beginning of Superfund, and we were the first in the nation to have that bill, which then former Assemblyman, I could never get a vote for the income tax, Florio. He got to do that later on his own, but he was one of my
You lived to regret it.
Well, you stick around long enough, and sometimes these things happen. It became Superfund. That was, again, one of the opportunities that New Jersey had to say, these problems are all over the country. We need a federal partnership here. That bill in particular was of great importance. The transit bill was of great importance. The Pinelands bill was the one that was kind of in the middle there, but took a long time to get it put in place, and that became, I think that's one of the things the governor is most proud of in terms of his legacy, and that has not been simple to that hasn't been simple to get to work any more than the new Highlands preservation bill will be simple to get to work.
Expand a bit on the Pinelands bill, which as you go on to your next role, you have a sort of different mission in relation to that legislation. But talk about, as the bill is going through the legislature, and what you remember about those days.
The Pinelands.
Mm-hmm.
This is one that became extremely contentious. And of course, now we have South Jersey in the forefront. We have a different role of players than were in the normal mix. But we had the benefit of Steve Persky, very bright, very progressive, also someone whose family had been involved in politics in New Jersey for a long time, as basically the key person. Bill Gormley. But you know, there'd been a commission, and I never did understand the role of the commission that was existing. But David Bardeen is the governor's first commissioner of environmental protection in his first administration, who, as you know, was the one that caused that to happen. He brought it to the governor's attention. He brought it as a federal issue. He brought it as a critical aquifer for the Northeast, not just New Jersey, and then this vision of conservation to retain the purity of that water source that was so required and that is still required. And then the uniqueness of the flora and fauna. I think, you know, a case was being made. I don't think that was the end all and be all, but suddenly that became, as part of the environmental movement, the need to save endangered species and plants, and to encourage patterns of growth and planning in those kinds of areas that had just been helter-skelter. I mean, it had been an industrial area. It had been an important glass, cranberry, iron forging. You know, something had gone on there, and that had gone out, except for the glass making and the cranberries. But the glass making is now gone. Cranberries are still there. Blueberries. So it wasn't exactly, you know, a robust economic facility. It was probably, you know, you just drove through there. And then this attention. If there hadn't been the kind of economic growth and population growth that then came in to go around it, I don't know that it would have ever risen to the point of being saved.
Another issue during the first term was the authorization of casino gambling in Atlantic City. What was your personal take on that? We've heard from some people during this series of interviews that they were against it and argued to Brendan Byrne that he should be against it also.
Well, I don't think I was crazy about it. I mean, you know, like, oh yay, that's wonderful. As a vehicle, I mean, anybody that had been to Atlantic City and saw that this was just this was a dreadful place. How in the world they were ever going to turn it into anything was going to take some sort of miracle. And to have that franchise, I mean, as much as the fact that I wasn't crazy about it. If it could have been something else, I might have been a little more enthusiastic about it. Because the signature of gambling was not attractive. It did not seem to attract a wonderful group of people in the public mind. And what did I know about it? Nothing. I'd never met anybody in the gaming industry, although I had been to it, Las Vegas once, but not to gamble. And so I wasn't being oh my heavens, this is the most awful thing, because I could see that something that would spark plug the end of this blight was worth a try. And of course they had one referendum that had failed statewide, so it wasn't as if it hadn't been road tested. It had been road tested to put it in a place where to bring back a resort, which is all it was. And again, we enter Steve Persky. Bright, the sort of person that would be able to take that show on the road and sell it. But some of the other things that happened in the course of that was that we, in fact, went on lots of fact-finding tours of our own, especially because and taking with us the law enforcement people, because without that, it is something that I would have found a great difficulty in trying to be enthusiastic about. So the strong prosecutor Byrne, who used to run around with Charlie Corella and throw all these people in jail. Don't forget that one of the first things they did was to set up the lottery commission and say, instead of throwing these people in jail, why don't we let them work for us? And we'll legitimize this. So there was a track record there, too, that it hasn't turned out to be as successful in terms of rehabilitating the entire city beyond 2 blocks is a disappointment.
Well, let's move closer to the 1977 re-election. You said that you, even after the income tax vote, you thought that Brendan Byrne could get re-elected. Polls are showing that he's continuing to fall in public approval ratings. Within the party, he's facing opponents some of whom eventually formally declared their candidacies against him in the primary. What was your own sort of feeling about his re-election prospects as you move into that primary season? Some people have suggested that they thought he should have pulled out of the race because it would be too embarrassing for him and the family and too difficult. What were you advising him to do, or what was your take on his personal feelings?
I think he wanted to do it. The Irishness was up, and I think he knew he was doing the right thing. As far as I was concerned, he was doing what he had an obligation to do. And then to walk away from it and say, that's too tough for me, wrong message. If you went down doing the right thing, you went down doing the right thing. Easy for someone to say who wasn't going to have, did I have any personal concerns about whether he won or he didn't win? If he didn't win, I'd go back to my law firm, go back to the law practice. Some people, by the way, did not have that kind of flexibility or opportunity, and it's very tough to have anybody be really nice to you if you've just come out of a losing losing administration. But I thought that it was a good administration, that he had done the right things, that he had found gifted people to be in his administration who had worked very, very hard. And he had an obligation to them, too.
Now, as he considers his decision whether to run or not, and also to plan for a potential campaign, what were the mechanics of getting organized for that campaign?
Henry Luther and Bob Torricelli. Henry, leave your job as Chief of Staff. Bob, leave your job and go and set up this headquarters where I think Brendan's family were the ones who were manning it to begin with. A lot of, the support that had been there in that first campaign wasn't there. So the institutional thing of, can you raise the money? Are the polls that bad? It wasn't as if anybody was standing by and say, run, Brendan, run. Those are fairly depressing days, because, you know, it's one thing to say you're going to run again, and it's another thing to say that you're going to attract the money and you're going to attract the attention and you're going to win.
Jerry, let's begin again at the sort of early stages of the planning for the 1977 re-election campaign. Who were the sort of key people beyond Henry Luther and Bob Torricelli that you mentioned before our break that were involved in the behind-the-scenes planning?
Oh, well, by that point, they'd hired a pollster. They'd hired operatives, and their roles were ones that, in some ways, we were rather sheltered from. John Degnan and I became the ones who were left to run things on a day-to-day basis while everybody else was out campaigning. And by left to, meaning, you know, that everybody else was off on the campaign. And that's pretty much the way it was envisioned.
Well, you mentioned the polls. One of the documents we've come across in searching through the various archives was a poll that apparently Jim Florio commissioned that showed that Brendan Burns' prospects for re-election were pretty dim. Do you recall what the early Byrne polls were telling him?
I just was told that it wasn't so hot. But, you know, that's almost like saying we're turning our lives over to the technicians, my view. The drive of an individual candidate, of course, as Brendan himself will tell you, that there was nothing more wonderful than having 9 people believe that he was vulnerable so he could run against those 9 and splinter them all over the place, including, I think, the fellow that worked for me, Jeffrey Ketterson. Jim Florio was a serious candidate. And as all primaries go, I mean, you know, that somehow or another a fight within the family is a very tough fight. It's hard for people to come back from that.
Now, you mentioned how many candidates entered to oppose Brendan Byrne. And in a way, that was a sign of his perceived political weakness, but it was also, as it turned out, a great benefit in splitting the anti-Byrne vote. Do you recall discussions about whether to keep this as a multi-candidate race, or were there attempts to sort of recruit one or two of the opponents to the Byrne side to try to build a larger base?
Yeah, there may have been, but I wasn't part of that.
What other strategies do you recall? I mean, were there sort of attempts to sort of target particular constituencies like labor and so forth?
That's when, going back to a certain segment, you know, in an unlikely place, which he probably didn't, you know, he probably carried it because of his earlier campaign, but I think that I've earlier said that Faraborz Fatemi kept saying, now, Governor, we really must go back to Ocean County. We really must go back and meet with the people who are the senior citizens that were really going to benefit as a result of the change in the property tax and what the income tax was going to do for them. So that was one group. Then you had Bergen County, heavily Republican traditionally, except in small pockets. But those were the commuters that were going to benefit as a result of what had happened. And so it was a pocketbook issue that was the reverse pocketbook issue in some ways of what people thought, oh, they're just going to be taking more money from me. In some instances, they were going to be saving money, or it was going to be, certainly, I don't think anyone ever suggested that it wasn't a fairer tax as opposed to a regressive tax.
What was your role in this campaign, where you were obviously more of an insider in the Byrne staff and organization than you were in the first 73 campaign?
My role during that campaign was to basically see to it that government from the governor's office kept running. And so, I learned a lot of stuff about what went on every day that I hadn't ever had any responsibility for before. And so John Degnan and I basically were the people who were not out on the trail except on rare occasions, and which did, and of course it would have been inappropriate for us to be doing political work while we had our state jobs.
What was your perception of the primary campaign? Was there a key point where you thought things were swinging Brendan Burns' way, or was it just, in general, you thought that he had a decent shot given how many candidates were in the race and how split the vote would be?
Of course, at that point, I was such a partisan that I'm sure I saw everything positively, and that he didn't seem to lose. While he may have had some, like the public might have been upset with him, I didn't have the sense that the pencil press was against him, or that there was this drumbeat of Brendan Byrne, the most unpopular governor. The thing that they did to Jim Florio for so many years, the unpopular governor. What they say his name, the unpopular governor, the one who brought back the income tax. Now they do it with McGreevy of the scandal-ridden, etc. He didn't seem to pick up that kind of moniker. He seemed to retain the respect of most of the press, as far as the clips that I could see. So that was a very positive, and we all saw the clips about what was going on all the time. And I would go and talk with Henry from time to time, and from Bob, and those guys were real operatives. I have never been an operative. That wasn't what I did. Beyond, I was an organizer. I wasn't an operative.
Well, in fact, he does win the primary election, again helped quite a bit by the split in the vote of the anti-Byrne candidates. What are your recollections of election night on primary night?
Again, elation, and everybody suddenly, I always knew he would win. Well, they didn't always think he was going to win, but at that point, suddenly everybody thought he was always going to win.
Of course, unlike 1973, the upcoming general election campaign is looking much tougher. The Republicans have nominated Senator Bateman, who is viewed as a formidable candidate. Polls are showing a very strong lead for Senator Bateman early in the campaign. What was your own sort of feeling about the strategy and about Ray Bateman as an opponent for Brendan Byrne?
Well, first of all, on a personal basis, Ray Bateman is a very likable person, again, a gentleman, somebody that if he told you that's what his vote was going to be, that's what his vote was going to be. Progressive, had been part of the Blue Ribbon Commission, had always been a very serious policy person in terms of, what should happen with the state, well versed in the history of the state. And from a district that was going to, it would be pretty hard for him to lose his own district. Very popular, and someone whose personal company everyone enjoyed. So he was not going to, almost the 180 of Charlie Sandman, who did not share all of those qualities. And then I think he, as we know, subsequently he put out his own plan using former Secretary of the Treasury William Simon to help him put it together. And then when it was announced, magically the secretary disappeared, and he went away, or he went on vacation or what have you, and So Senator Bateman was left to defend the famous BS plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as soon as you can take something that's pretty serious and make a satire out of it, which became one of the hallmarks of Brendan Burns' abilities, great satirist, and being very witty about it at the time, but usually hitting the mark, which of course people like the pencil press absolutely adore because it's quotable, and it then becomes something that is that can't be defended no matter how you try, because it's now got a stamp on it of being ludicrous, and that's very tough to come behind no matter how good a person you are.
At the colloquium that was held here this past September, Governor Byrne said that his secretary, Dorothy Seltzer, advised against him using that BS line to describe the Bateman-Simon plan. What was your own take on it?
It seemed to me it did describe the plan, and of course, God be good to her, our good Dorothy also came out of another era when politics may have been as rough and tumble, or even rougher and more tumbler, but she believed that everybody in their public persona should be viewed as a lady and a gentleman, and so that he should not, describe things in this, with this type of argot. But that's when you started to see that Brendan Byrne was enjoying himself. He was starting to like the whole thing because, number one, he had much to brag about, much to say, I've done what I set out to do. I have a record of achievement with all these people that worked so hard to put it into place, the legislature, all of the people in state government, the judiciary, the kind of government that you'd like to look back on and say, well, every now and then there's a golden era, and if you're lucky to hit it, he hit it. Why not? And then you've got something to brag about. And if you called the other person's plan as something less than exemplary, that was all right.
Did you feel that that press conference where the Bateman-Simon plan was taken apart by Cliff Goldman and others in the administration in terms of its reality in looking at the state budget and finances, was the turning point for that 1977 campaign?
I think so. It also showed the arrogance of someone coming in, which is the way it was played. Well, let's bring in a former Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, he can really, someone who does not know that level of detail, was never burdened with that level of detail, give it a polish and a shine, because he had blessed it with a mistake.
Now, in the final days leading to the election, how confident were you?
Pretty confident. Pretty confident. And I think that we could feel it. You could feel it. The press wasn't a surprise when the editorial started coming out, that saying, well, you may have done a lot of things that we didn't like, but you have to admire him for doing it and for having the strength of character to do it.
And I guess you've already suggested, indirectly at least, that during the 1977 campaign, Brendan Byrne seemed to be having a much better time campaigning on the day-to-day stump. Is that true? Oh,
yeah. I think he was, first of all, he knew the people now. He knew what their names were sometimes. He was making the effort. He wanted it. He wasn't being dragged reluctantly into rooms to say, please stand up here and say X, Y, and Z. Doesn't mean it wasn't physically brutalizing. All campaigns are. even if you know you're going to lose. And nobody ever believes they're going to lose, by the way. You know, anybody who's a real Paul in their heart thinks they're going to win, even if the polls show them to be so dismal that, you know, nobody in their right mind would vote for you. You never know. And I think he was starting to enjoy it.
And I guess he was better at it, too.
Oh, couldn't help but be.
He was so bad the first time.
Couldn't help but be.
Both Dick Leone and Dan O'Hearn each separately described his performance in 1973 as terrible.
Well, there's a committee of three that agree.
What was election night like?
Oh,
77.
It was. First of all, it was a relief. You know, and an emotional outburst of, this is over, because it doesn't matter in those last days. You're never taking a really deep breath. You're never going, you know, until that last vote is in. And, you know, then there's always some problems, and did this really happen, did that really happen? But that was more exciting than the first.
Now, after he is reelected, at some point you talk to him, or he talks to you, about what your personal position is going to be, and describe those conversations.
Well, I did not believe that I would stay on in the next administration. And I had some conversations with people, you know, outside of government, that I thought it was time to move on and do something else. And I had suggested to when Dave Bardeen left in the first administration, I had a long admiration for this former mayor of Red Bank by the name of Dan O'Hearn. And so I said one day to Dan, would you consider coming down to Trenton to be DEP commissioner? And he, of course, had his established practice in Red Bank. And then I mentioned it to the governor, who also, of course, he knew Dan. And so Dan came down to be commissioner, and of course was absolutely terrific. He was served for about a year. And then the governor asked about my interest in moving into the judiciary, and I told him I did not think so. But I thought that Dan O'Hearn would be a good candidate to do that. And that's when he said, well, maybe if Dan comes here and you go over to DEP. I'd been asked to go to DEP a couple of times beforehand and just said, no, this is, you know, not a good time, given all the things that were going on in the legislature. That was so key at that point that we passed those bills. So that's when Dan and I switched jobs. But not before somebody named Don Linky prepared me to go in to talk with the legislature, and you don't remember it, but I do, and this is so good that I remember something you don't remember. That before I was going before the Senate Judiciary Committee, you suggested that I bring up the fact that New Jersey really had to concentrate on toxic waste, and that would be something they would be very interested in, and of course that turned out to be the key issue in that hearing.
And as you sort of take office as Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, did you have some trepidation? This is a very big and important department with a lot of people. It's a role that you really haven't played in your prior career. Was that a little scary?
Well, I had one advantage, and that was that I had been, because of my position, and I had been to all the cabinet meetings, at the request of the governor. That wasn't always what everybody in the governor's office thought we ought to be doing, but I knew perfectly well I wasn't going to know what was going on if I didn't go to the cabinet meetings. I also attended all the press conferences because that's how I found out what he was really thinking and telling people. So, you know, you have to stay what's going on every single day. I had had the benefit of dealing with the entire government, because there would be either appointments to be made or a piece of legislation that had to get moved or a budget to be passed. So I'd really had the benefit of a very big picture of government in all of the departments. But I had a personal affinity and some background on the environmental side. And I probably wasn't half as scared as I should have been, looking back. It just seemed to me like it was going to be a very interesting but difficult job.
You mentioned toxic waste. What were the other key issues that you remember during your time as commissioner?
Well, the toxic wastes were manageable. I mean, just go get the money. Go get Superfund passed. I didn't expect to have chemical control blow up on my watch and become the poster child for Superfund. But I testified.
That was in Jersey City, right?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, that's right.
I testified more than any other commissioner in the country for Superfund, which you recall the President Carter signed in the 11th day of December in lame duck of his administration. So it was this secret bill that got passed because of Congressman Florio and Senator Bradley from New Jersey, understanding that we had, and I was ready, I had every single potential site all ready to put into the Congress. We're always accused of having the most sites. Well, that was on purpose. That was so we would be sure and be first in line for funding. And I did make the commitment to the people that I was working with that when I left, my goals were to see to it that they had all of the people they needed, that they had all of the legislation that they needed, and they had all of the money that they needed in order to run that department. So those were my goals, which made it, but it was really different. I mean, you know, it was one thing to sit in the governor's office and say, you will do these things, and here's the list, and stop having your people say this crazy thing in the press, and another thing to run it on a day-to-day line basis, which was invaluable training. And that's when I really became better educated about the level of personnel that we are lucky to have in this state, because they were terrific.
And of course, in your new role, you have a key sort of implementation role with the Pinelands program that had begun in the governor's first term. Talk a little bit about that, although much of it, I guess, was still being run or directed from the governor's office, even in the second.
It was, but then we had, you know, Betty Wilson basically had been working on it as the deputy to David Vardeen. And so she continued to work on it, and then she left the state and went to Interior, where she, you know, had other kinds of roles, but because of its dual jurisdiction of federal and state, it was very helpful to have somebody at Interior to keep working on those roles. And of course, this is when the role of somebody like Marilyn Berry Thompson was absolutely critical to keep the money coming in the appropriations that were required, as well as what the state had to do. But I don't recall there being that much. The commission was getting set up. I mean, getting the people on the commission, that sort of thing, that remained critical, but it wasn't one of the things that was first and foremost on the things that I was finding. As with all such departments, you end up doing a lot of reactive work, and the extent to which you can do something proactive is pretty rare. Also, in my time, we had a major drought. And that was, when I said you could deal with toxic waste, you can't make it rain. And then I found out that there were committees that had studied this issue in 1969, put out major reports, and not a single thing had been done. So the infrastructure trusts, those kinds of things became the next thing. We you know, I had a drought czar I had really gifted people working for me, for the state, but that I knew that if I told them, you man this hotline 24 hours a day, it was going to get manned. And people are going to be answering the phone for people whose whole businesses could be destroyed because they wouldn't get enough water. So we had to have allocation systems set up and then start to work with the private purveyors to ensure that the water got wheeled around the state in the way that very imperfect, and then we had to work with New York State and the Port Authority and to be able to get the Delaware River Basin water allocated to us on an emergency basis. Run pipes across the George Washington Bridge. They had been supposed to go out to the first Gulf War, and so they were sitting there. I said, I'll take those pipes.
Now, in your role as commissioner of a department, you're a member of the cabinet. You had mentioned that you'd attended cabinet meetings when you were on the governor's staff. How did the cabinet meetings run, both in your perspective when you were in the governor's office and later as you're in the cabinet? Did you think they were effective, or were they disorganized, or just how did you feel they played out in terms of either advising the governor or implementing programs?
I thought they were pretty perfunctory. Rarely did anything of real substance get discussed there. I think those turned out to be individual meetings that the commissioners would have with the chief of staff and then ultimately with the governor. They were generalist meetings. And it was a nice opportunity for everyone to see one another and try to keep some of them awake, because they were not considered to be, lightning was going to strike, you know, Shazam. The extent to which I don't recall, and I'm sure it did happen, and when the governor speaks about it, he'll know better, about whether or not he ever expected to get the advice of everybody about any issue. But there were the parts that turned out to be of particular interest were the ones where the economists came in, and they would give us their forecasts of how the economy was going. And all of the commissioners, as I recall, were asked to attend. I never missed any of them because I found them to be terribly important to the role of government with the private sector and the ways in which the economy was going to be affected from the academics' point of view and from the working economists. You'll recall the chief economist for the New York Stock Exchange was the chair of it at the time, and that perspective was invaluable.
Any other recollections of your days as commissioner that you wanted to share?
Well, it kind of shows you the parks were the stepchild. They never had enough money. These were really dedicated people. This was a vocation that, you know, they weren't going to have any other place. There weren't other places where these jobs would exist. And so we had world-class people involved in silviculture, involved in wildlife, in finding a new fish hatchery. You know, these kinds of things that were tough to get money for, but they were just critical to having the state be what it should be and could be. But everybody, you start to find out who these people are and what have you. So I said, because it was always just, it was whatever disaster was going to go on the next day, every Friday, please put me into the park, some park, any place, so I can be there and, you know, kind of regenerate myself. We were in the middle of a drought, and I was in a helicopter with the head of my solid waste group, and he was a very experienced person. And I told him about that. And he said, "Commissioner, I know just how you feel. When I feel depressed, I like to go out and visit a landfill." that gave me some perspective on what it is that makes somebody's day, but also shows you what, somebody who knows their business is able to bring to the things that have to be done by government.
Of course, Governor Byrne also gave the anecdote when he was here in September about how he hated the opening day of fishing season. Yeah, some of the photographs we have show you fishing alongside him. How did you feel?
Well, I was a problem because they'd never had a female commissioner before. And the state, had an opening day, but the fellows who were involved in that from the wildlife group were invited to come to this men's club that had a private thing, across that they had leased. So they had this private place which was what their best fishing was, and they had no problem taking the governor there and Bob Mulcahy and those guys that all fished. But they had something of a problem with me. And first of all, how were they going to get themselves to get me invited? And so what they did, which I found really quite touching, was that the first, in January, because it was going to be, February or so, they came and called on me. Commissioner, they explained the problem to me. On the other hand, if you're willing to learn how to fly fish, I said, I'm willing to learn how to fly fish. They took me out into the yard at the old Labor and Industry building, and we did practice rolls week after week after week, and they were tying flies for me, and we had fish talk that you can't believe. So on the opening day of fishing, I have got all my gear, because and they are looking at me like somebody's kid who's going to the recital. Out we went. I got it. And I got the pictures to prove it. And I don't care if they salted that and they had some guy in a wetsuit putting that fish on that hook. I was able to come back with my fish. And Brendan was over there gritting his teeth because he hated it so much. And I was having a wonderful time. I thought it was such fun. And for years, I would get a little present from this one man that patiently made these wonderful, beautiful little pieces of artwork. I'm not going to tell you that this is how I now spend the rest of my life, but there were symbols that were going on there. And I think the day that really changed things with that department for me, that section, was that Dan, for some reason or another, decided that they couldn't spring to put in a new facility for the farm fishing. How they grow the fish.
Agriculture.
The agricultural thing. And so I said, I think we can find the money. And I went over and talked with Phil Lampe and said, let's do this together. And then they had just found a brand new source of spring water.
Of course, another initiative that you pressed as commissioner was to get a new building for the department.
Oh, yes. Well, that was when I was the opportunity of having worked in the governor's office, and I watched that everybody was kind of tiptoeing around every time they had to deal with the treasurer, and I kept wondering why that was. So the day came when, this was an impossible building. And they told me that there was nothing that could be done about it, and I spied some piece of property and said, it's a state property, I take it. Got some shovels, went out there, got the press, started digging. I thought Cliff Goldman was going to have a heart attack. Turned out that we probably didn't really own it. But then he, the die was cast. We had to have that building.
Well, as the administration moves toward a close, any final thoughts about the administration as a whole? Do want to spend some time with your post-administration career, but I wouldn't. My partner was right. I would have kicked myself if I had missed it.
I mean, there were lots of times about it which I don't think I've ever worked that hard in my life. I don't think people that have those kinds of jobs can do them for very long. They are burnout things you're on 24/7 if you're at that level of government. The responsibility is palpable. The opportunity is not to be missed. And the level of people that I came in contact with, the excitement of what was going on. I mean, not every day was terrific, but you had a reason to go to work every single day, and you had responsibilities. And I said before, you know, if you could be part of the golden era of government, I think that's as close as it comes.
Another position that Brendan Byrne asked you to take on was as a commissioner on the board of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Sort of talk about that experience.
Well, I think that is absolutely the best appointed position that anybody can get in this state or in New York State. Again, the very highest level of responsibility, it's the heart of the transportation system. All of the airports, the tunnels, the bridges, the path system, then the World Trade Center, and the opportunity to work with some very gifted people, Peter Goldmark in particular, who was executive director, the opportunity to watch the two governors relate to one another about projects that were important to each state, the level of people that were serving as commissioners. Again, the career people at the Port Authority who were at that point, you know, everyone came and they were going to make a career there if they chose to. Luke Ambasini is a perfect example of someone who began as Austin Tobin's intern and then rises to run path, comes to us to be the commissioner, goes back again, and then eventually comes to Rutgers for the Voorhees Institute with Martin Robbins. And Martin being another example of somebody who was, you know, a very gifted lawyer and brought into public service planning at the Port Authority, then comes to New Jersey. I don't know if he was at New Jersey Transit. I can't remember. But I don't think he went to SEPTA with Lou, but then, you know, now here running the Institute. These are the kinds of people that one was in contact with very, very important issues that were facing the Port Authority, trying to fulfill its bi-state compact responsibilities to ensure that there was, you know, that they weren't stopping the trains in the middle of the Hudson River to say, oh, we've got a border dispute here. That it was going to work, that the system that was set up of the veto of the minutes, which is of course the sort of thing that you worked on. I'm not saying that those were issues that were always smooth. There were many times they were not. There was always a push to raise the fares. And of course Governor Byrne had been part of the conversations when Governor Minor got into the compact to begin with. And so he had his own views about that and was always annoyed with me when I voted for a fare increase.
Well, you've served in a lot of nonprofit positions and with advisory groups over the years. You're currently a commissioner and chair of the New Jersey Election Law Enforcement Commission. Describe that role and the sort of responsibilities of the Election Commission.
Well, this is another situation where you pass the legislation, and I serve as chair, and the principal sponsor, Albert Burstein, is a commissioner as well. Now we have to run it. So it's one thing to pass something, and it's another thing to see that it actually runs. It is a remarkable institution that, again, it goes to the ethics of government, the transparency of government, the opportunity for people to know where the money, who's giving the money for an election campaign, how it's spent, the reporting responsibilities, and now it's moved on to the lobbyists. It's moved on to who gets government contracts that are not put out for bid. And that is just a recent part of that legislation. So again, I go back to this theme that you've been hearing me carry on about, and that is the level of expertise, dedication of the civil servants of the state, and seeing to it that they come with wanting to do this thing. You know, this is exciting. This is their excuse me, professional goal, and can they stay the course because they get the money, the people, the legislation they need. This is where I came in. And so, you know, having the government know about them, having the public know about them, getting the support of the academic communities. Eagleton Institute has always been part of coming to hearings, to being critical about what it is that's trying to, giving a constructive suggestion. It's a very, very interesting institution, and it's growing very rapidly, and I will be meeting with the treasurer to make sure the revenues are there.
Of course, you're currently partner in a major and one of the oldest and getting to be one of the larger New Jersey law firms practicing environmental law for the most part. How has that sort of been a different experience from your days in government?
Oh, very much. Except that I think that I would not, first of all, when I first began that practice, it was a relatively new practice and hardly anyone had one. As a matter of fact, most corporations didn't think they needed to pay any attention to it, and it didn't affect them. Well, they've gotten disabused of that because environmental decisions are part of every company's activities, one way or another, and especially if they are manufacturing companies, or now we're trying to reuse property. It's moved into transactional areas as well, where we try to, you know, reestablish the Gold Coast and all other properties that otherwise would be fallow and would be threatening. So there's been a continuum of that early legislation, but okay, now clean it up, get the money to do it. Now that we've done that, what are you going to do with it? How can we turn that into what will be beneficial to the society and will be sustainable by the companies and go through the transactions that it needs to go through? It's been a very, very interesting practice, and I think it will now start to move in the directions of eminent domain and how we value properties. It's a field that combines science with the regulatory world, and again, bringing expertise, the right expertise, to government, so that there is true peer review on a project, that respected professionals are on all sides. I think that has been the goal. I think it's happening.
Jerry, we started the chronology sort of midway in your career. I wanted, before we finished, to give you an opportunity to talk about your sort of upbringing, childhood, education, and also your current family.
Well, I had a very interesting childhood. Did you ever see the movie The Music Man?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was done after my father's life, except he sold violins, not trombones. So we always had a very interesting household, and his father had been one of the founders of the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota. My mother's first or second boyfriend was Hubert Humphrey, another Nonpartisan League person, and my grandfather said that he thought Hubert was a very nice boy, but he just talked too much.
A lot of other people thought the same thing.
Well, so there were always politics being discussed at our dinner table. And my father always had a great interest in this. I found out they canceled out one another's votes when they were actually going to the polls, my mother and my father. And I was born in Texas and brought up in the Midwest until my father decided to go to California. And so he started a small resort that attracted the press people and the movie people and the bigger stars of the time. And so that was the environment in which I grew up in as a teenager.
Do you remember any of those stars?
Oh, absolutely. I got to babysit for Joan Crawford's children, who were just like they're described in those books. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Burl Ives was a great friend of my father's, and because of Meredith Willson coming to the lodge, Fitzgerald Mountain Lodge, that's how come he got the story of the Music Man. And so I have some wonderful, and they remained friends, you know.
Even though he didn't pay for the story.
Well, my mother was very upset that they discussed things in terms of pool halls because she was marrying the librarian. She said that we'd never had anything to do with pool halls, and so we had to explain a little bit about artistic license. But he always had, my dad always had, he was a great character. You would have absolutely liked him. Maybe you got to meet him. He was very impressed with Brendan Byrne. He called him Brendan Byrne, and Dan O'Hearn were his two favorites because he would come from California for things like my swearing in and, you know, some other events. And he called Brendan Byrne as an honest man. And I've sure seen a lot of politicians. So he gave this stamp of approval to him. And then to Dan O'Hearn, he called him Mr. Nice. And those two got on like a house of fire. So he loved the stuff that was going on that I was doing. But he was always, you know, pretty straightforward about there will be corrupt people. And I think he thought that I was just so rosy, you know, glasses about everything that I didn't see any of this in people. And of course, he was a little more right than I was. But again, I was in this time period when that was not what was happening, and so it was a lucky time. But anyway, I went to Stanford University, took international relations as a degree. Even though in junior high I'd kind of said, gee, I think I'd like to be a lawyer, and I was told, well, there'll be a dime a dozen, so study for the Foreign Service. So that's what I did. Then I met a very nice man called Alan English, and we married, and he went into the service for NROTC, and we ended up on the East Coast with him at MIT to get his doctorate, and for me to go to law school. But in the meantime, I was following the ship, so I lived in Japan and I lived in France and found his ship. And then one day he said, well, there's this place called Bell Labs. Where's that? It's in New Jersey. Well, I've never been to New Jersey before. Well, I've now been to New Jersey since 1963, and I'm very proud of this state.
And move on a little bit from law school and the sort of beginnings of your legal and political career.
Well, at the time I started law school, I had two children. I had the third 3 weeks before my final exam in law school. So when I moved to New Jersey, we had 3 small children. And I was looking for a place to study for the bar, and someone introduced me to Mr. English of McCarter and English. And the first thing he said to me was, I think you should stay home and take care of your children, And my husband told him to mind his own business. And that was the beginning. We lived in the same town. We threw away each other's third-class mail. Woody English told that story on himself years later. I happened to have a second-grade teacher for a daughter of mine, and that second-grade teacher said, "Gee, what are you doing? Holly's doing fine." "Well, looking for a place to study for the bar. Well, call up my husband." And so I did, and almost 40 years later, I'm still practicing law with him, except from my time in government. So it's been a very, very, I had been a partner in a law firm before I came to government. I knew very little about the state in retrospect, not half enough of what I should have known. And I probably would have been more productive if I had had a better archive of the state. What I learned from the League of Women Voters, and then starting to run for office.
What prompted you to get more active in politics?
Well, it's always been, I always thought I wanted to be a United States Senator. And so that ambition didn't go away. Being a lawyer was, an obvious thing to do. And that way I started to know something about the politics of the state and be interested in it and liking it.
Okay. But you said you sort of early worked outside the organization structure.
Yes.
Didn't pay your dues within the party.
No, that came later on. And I was a member of the National Democratic Party on the executive committee, so I saw it on a national basis. And I found that to be less than rewarding. I mean, I think, at least in that particular time, aside from the fact of the chairman that was a remarkable chairman. I did have that benefit of one chairman, but I didn't serve with him.
That was Robert Strauss?
Yes, and Ambassador Strauss was a remarkable person. And he'd call me up on election night and say, "How's everything?" And I'd say, "Well, Mr. Chairman, I think it's..." He says, "I'm just minding my traps. How are Brendan and Jimmy Dugan getting along?" Not that he knew, everything about what was going on. Those little fellows were not getting along at that time too well. I said, "Oh, it's fine, Mr. Chairman." I'm glad to hear that. So, those were the kinds of things that we got to do. And I met a lot of very interesting people. But were they substantive? No. But Bobby Torricelli showed up then too. So, these people kept reappearing in various roles because Bob said to me at the end of the first administration after Brendan got elected, he said, I've been invited to join Vice President Mondale's staff. What do you think? Of course, I had my answer, which is, you'll really be mad at yourself if you don't do that. So, that's when he started to be, which was very helpful to us, because and Brendan was the first governor to endorse Jimmy Carter. With having Bobby in the vice president's office, we had entrees to the White House, as you recall, that were invaluable for the state of New Jersey.
Any final thoughts before we end?
Oh, my heavens. I think I have talked to you for so long that anyone that can stay with this has clearly got a master's degree. And I see my friend Nick there, who's going to get ready to see. Would this be a good documentary for him to do? I don't know that it will sell anywhere, but it's certainly a wonderful memoir of a very interesting time. And I wouldn't have missed it.